Hey guys, I'm back by the fire and I have another awesome story to share with you. Today's story is this epic survival story, and I mean the story itself is truly unbelievable, but I'm telling you, the twist at the end, basically how this person was able to survive, you will not see coming. Great plot twist, great story, I know you're gonna like it. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come join you at your campfire, but when they show up, just immediately push them into the flames and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 10 a.m. on March 18, 1944, a 26-year-old Finnish soldier named Aimo Koivunen sat around a campfire with a group of other soldiers inside of the Arctic Circle in Northern Europe. They were very deep into the wilderness in this forest that was covered in several feet of snow. And Aimo was melting a pot of that snow over the fire so the group could drink some tea. And at the same time that Aimo was doing this, even though it was kind of relaxing to be sitting here, Aimo, his whole body was basically aching. Number one, it was 5 degrees outside, and this was also the first time that he and the other soldiers had stopped to rest in about 2 days. They had been on the move the whole time. So Aimo and his squadron were all members of the Finnish military. And at this point, during World War II, they were actually allied with Nazi Germany. Not because, they were Nazis, they were not, but because Finland and Germany shared a common enemy, the Soviet Union. Right now, Aimo and his squadron were in an area called Lapland, which used to belong to Finland. But 4 years earlier, the Soviet Union had invaded Finland and ultimately forced Finland to cede this land to the Soviets. But now, during World War II, Finland wanted to get their land back, and Germany was helping them do that. And so Aimo and his squadron were in Lapland on essentially a reconnaissance mission. They were there to try to figure out sort of what the Soviets were doing in this part of Lapland and how many Soviets were out there, again, in this particular part of Lapland. However, Aimo and the others had spent the past 2 days skiing all over the place in their area of operations, but so far, they hadn't seen any Soviet soldiers or any Soviet bases. But, for Aimo, and probably for the other soldiers that he was with, this was ultimately a good thing. They were trained for combat, but they didn't necessarily want to come across Soviets and have like a full-blown shootout, in part because the Soviets were just a bigger, more well-equipped military. And, they were also more advanced, and so if they got into a gunfight with them, who knows what would have happened. And so even though Aimo is like sitting here feeling very sore and very tired as he melts his snow, he was ultimately feeling kind of grateful that this reconnaissance mission had proven to be pretty low-key. However, just as the water began to boil, Aimo and the other soldiers heard the unmistakable sound of machine gun fire coming from somewhere that had to be nearby. And so immediately Aimo and the others, they jump up, forget what they're doing, and they're looking to see where this gunfire is coming from. But then before they could even make sense of the situation, Aimo's lieutenant yelled like, "Hey, get ready, get your guns." And so they all scooped up their weapons. Aimo, he's picking his weapon up, and as he looks up, he looked off in the distance, maybe a quarter mile away, and he was shocked to see an entire pack of Soviet soldiers bearing down on them. They were literally skiing down this mountainside right nearby, and they were obviously shooting their machine guns, not in random directions, but right at Aimo and the other men. They were clearly being attacked by these Soviets. Now, Aimo and the other men have clearly been trained for this. This is literally why they're out here. They are soldiers. They're ready for this type of encounter. But for a moment, when Aimo sees this overwhelming force that's descending on them, they're clearly outnumbered, like this is going to end badly. All Aimo had in his head was just this overwhelming feeling of just terror. He was the oldest of 6 children, and when he first enlisted in the military, he had promised all of his little siblings that he wouldn't get hurt, he would come home, he would be okay. And now he knew that wasn't going to happen, like he was going to get killed, he just knew it. But Aimo, after sort of breaking out of this initial thought, he looked over at his lieutenant, and his lieutenant looked terrified too, but he quickly composed himself and yelled for Aimo and everybody else to flee. Just moments later, Aimo and the other Finnish soldiers were on their skis, skiing as fast as they could away from the Soviets down the backside of this mountain, just doing anything they could to survive. And as Aimo is skiing away, he can hear the sound of gunfire ricocheting off trees, zipping by his head, like he's thinking, at any point, I'm gonna get hit, or one of my teammates are gonna get hit. There's nothing we can do, we just gotta go as fast and as far as we can. And so he's skiing, and actually Aimo was at the front of their formation, so he's actually leading the pack. And so really it was his job to kind of create tracks in the snow that the others could follow in behind. It was easier for them, but it meant he was expending a lot of energy, basically pushing all the snow down as he was making his escape. And as much as he wanted to maintain that position and do this for his teammates, to continue to make tracks here, it was so exhausting. And also, like, when you're in combat, you have this unbelievable adrenaline rush that sometimes can lead to like a massive crash of energy. And it was like he had this huge rush of energy, and now it's like he's collapsing. Despite the need to escape here, it's like his body just cannot go any faster than he's going. And so before long, it's like he found himself slowing down, and his teammates are zipping by him because they can't stop. The bullets are flying fast, like their only hope of survival is just to keep on going. And so Aimo knows that, like, basically, if he can't keep up, he's dead. But his body, it was just, he couldn't go any faster. He was slowing down. He was going slower and slower. He can hear the sound of the gunfire getting closer and closer, and he's thinking about his siblings and how devastated they're going to be to find out that he was killed in this war. And so slower and slower he's going. The sounds are getting louder and louder behind him, and he sees the last of his teammates pass him, and he sees them just kind of drift off down the mountain into the white abyss beyond, and they're gone. He's alone. And he just can't keep up. And then finally, he just loses control of his skis. He veers off to the side. He starts tumbling down the mountain, smashes into a tree, and he passes out. When Aimo woke up, it was light outside, but he had no idea how much time had passed. He also really had no idea how he was even still alive. Like, what, did the Soviets just decide not to kill me? Or did they not see me? Like, what happened to my teammates? Like, what's going on? He had a lot of questions. But in addition to feeling confused about the whole situation, he also had this really distinct other feeling. He had this immense sense of being alert, like hyper alert, more than really he had ever been in his whole life. It's like he could hear and see everything at like a 10 times level. It's like, oh my God, I know everything going on around me. I'm totally aware. So with his like hyper vigilance that he suddenly was having sort of out of nowhere, he began to, take stock of his situation. Right away, he, was able to see that he's alone. Like, the Soviets are not nearby. He's not like being held captive. And again, his comrades are nowhere to be seen. So he's alone in the middle of the wilderness in the Arctic Circle. But he also could see that, okay, well, I still have my skis, so I can still get around. He still had his boots on. He still had his equipment on. Like, he had the things he needed to survive. He even had his compass still, which had been in his hand, but he hadn't lost it. And so he had a way to navigate, and he had his weapon still. And so he's thinking, okay, like, the situation's bad, but I have what I need to survive for some time. And he also realized that, sort of amazingly, despite clearly crashing as a minimum and smashing into this tree that he was laying near, despite that, he didn't feel any pain in his body. And he didn't appear to have any injuries. So he's thinking, what a miracle here, that the worst thing that's happened here is I've basically been abandoned and I'm effectively lost, but it could be worse. And so Aimo, after, taking stock of his situation, he eventually stood up and he looked off into the distance, and he saw maybe 6 or 7 miles away, there was smoke up on this mountain off in the distance. And he immediately recognized that mountain was actually what appeared to be the rendezvous point for he and his squadron if they ever got separated. And so he's looking out at this mountain and seeing, the signs of potential life over there, and he's thinking, oh my gosh, those are my teammates. That's where they've gone. They've gone to the rendezvous point. All I need to do is go to that mountain. So Aimo scooped up his backpack and picked up his gun and whatever other equipment he had on the ground. And then he started skiing towards this mountain. And for a while, he just kept on staring up at the smoke coming off the mountain, making sure he was going in the right direction. And as he got closer, he was nearly positive he could see that in addition to the smoke, he could see what appeared to be little lean-to tents on the mountainside, which were telltale signs that those were Finnish soldiers. That's how they set up their tents. And so he's thinking, this is it. Like, I'm going to be saved. I just got to get there. And he had so much energy, maybe because he was so close to being rescued or something, but he felt like this huge surge of energy. It was like nothing could make him tired. And then finally, Aimo got close enough to this campsite on the side of this mountain that he actually could see faces. He could see the other soldiers, and they were his, Finnish comrades. They had clearly gone to the rendezvous point, and they hadn't seen him yet. And so here he is, feeling like full of energy. He's barreling towards them, and he starts calling out to them. He's thinking they're going to be like totally shocked that, anybody would just come out of the wilderness towards their campsite, let alone Aimo, who they must have assumed by this point was dead. Also, he's thinking, I don't want them to shoot at me, thinking I'm a Soviet soldier, so I better get their attention. And so he's yelling out for his comrades. And at some point, one of the men, they turn and they see Aimo, and their reaction is not what Aimo wanted. Their reaction was being really shocked, grabbing their weapon and shooting at him. And before long, all these soldiers, all of his comrades, are opening fire on Aimo. And Aimo's like, come on, like, I'm one of you, what are you doing? But he's already going so fast, skiing so fast, that his only move was to basically ski right down the middle of their camp and just go to the other side of the mountain. And so he literally skied through this campsite with all of his comrades shooting at him, who miraculously missed him, so he doesn't get shot somehow. The bullets are whizzing past his head, and he's thinking, oh my gosh, they think I'm a Soviet. Come on, I'm calling out to you guys. I'm not a Soviet. But he barrels past them, and then after he's pretty far away from this campsite, he's yelling back to them like, guys, it's me, it's Aimo, what are you doing? But they're yelling and they're shooting in his direction, and so he had no choice but to just keep on skiing away from them, away from safety, or what he believed was going to be safety. And so on he went for hours and hours, just skiing and skiing away from this ambush, if you will. And the whole time he's thinking, like, what happened? Even if they shot at me at first, couldn't they have figured it out that, like, I'm one of you? Like, wouldn't you have realized that eventually as I skied right through your campsite? I have the same uniform as you. I have the same weapon as you. You recognize me? Like, what was that? And so he has no idea what happened, but he's like, how do I have so much energy? Like, how am I able to do this? I've been skiing for hours and hours and hours. I've been shot at so many times. Like, this is surreal. What's happening? Like, what is going on here? And so Aimo just continued skiing for hours and hours until it was abundantly clear he was not in shooting range. He didn't hear the sound of any gunfire. Like, he's safe again. Still very confused why this was even happening, but he's safe. The sun's gone down, and so he thinks, like, okay, I need to stop. I need to make camp. I need to regroup. But it was at this point that he's thinking to himself, like, I haven't eaten anything. I haven't had any water. I've basically been at a full sprint, like skiing at a full sprint here for practically the whole day. I've had multiple near-death experiences. I smashed into a tree during that initial, skirmish, but I feel great. I feel like I have more energy than I've ever had in my whole life. And so he's just caught by, like, how am I able to do this? Is this what it's like when you're in a true survival situation? Like your body just goes into like overdrive or something? Like he couldn't understand it. And so he's standing there, like, basically telling himself, you really need to stop. Even though you have the energy to go pretty much indefinitely, you need to stop, you need to make a fire, you need to have food, you need to have water, you need to rest. But it was like he was forcing himself to do these things. He didn't feel compelled to do them. It was like, oh, that's right, I need to, like, do human stuff. And so that's what he did. He stopped, he built a fire, he made some food, and he's like not hungry at all, but he's eating the food, forcing himself to. He's having some water. And then he's like, okay, I'll rest, and then in the morning I'll figure out what to do next. But he lays down to go to sleep, and he should have been completely exhausted, but he wasn't. He couldn't even sleep, like, not at all. He just laid there completely wide awake as the wind and sleet and snow whipped all around him, and he just laid there, again, feeling great, but just not tired at all. The next morning, when the sun came up, Aimo had not slept at all, but still he was able to get up, put his skis on, and get his stuff and continue skiing, basically in the direction that he believed would bring him back to Finland. And as he was skiing, he's thinking to himself, it's kind of interesting because when he first got attacked by the Soviets, it was like his mind was clear, but his body failed him. Like his legs got so tired from trying to cut those tracks in the snow that he fell off and crashed. And that sort of led him to this position. But now, for whatever reason, it was like his mind was delirious. Like he couldn't keep his thoughts straight, but his body was like a Terminator. Like he just kept on going no matter what. And so he just kept on skiing, almost like without even thinking. His body was like on autopilot. And so he skied for hours and hours and hours just in this one direction that he sort of loosely believed would bring him back to Finland. And the whole time he's skiing, he didn't see another soul. He is out in the middle of, the Arctic Circle. There's no more Soviets. There's no more teammates, nothing. He's just out in the middle of the wilderness. And realistically, he didn't know if he was even remotely going in the right direction, but he was just going to go. But that night, as he's still just skiing in a straight line, not stopping, sort of unbelievably, he looked up ahead and he saw somebody. The first person he had seen since, the ambush at the campsite. And even more unbelievable is the person he saw was one of his teammates. It was this guy named Maddie. He was a comrade of his. They had been together when the Soviets had first attacked. And so immediately Aimo's thinking, clearly Maddie got separated as well, and it's just serendipity that we have wound up at the same place. And so Aimo, he skis right up to Maddie, and he's waving him down. He's so relieved to see him. And Maddie, when he looks over at Aimo, he doesn't shoot at him, but he sort of tells him to be quiet, calm down, and he kind of beckons him over. And when Aimo comes up next to Maddie, he has all these questions what do we do? Where are we going? But Maddie just tells him just to be quiet and then gestures to lay down on the ground. And so Aimo doesn't really know what's going on here, but he trusts Maddie. Maddie is not shooting at him. That was a good sign. And so the two of them just laid in the snow. They laid down right there. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Aimo was able to feel tired enough that when he closed his eyes, he did drift off to sleep almost right away. When Aimo woke back up again, he was not lying down in the snow with Maddie. He was instead standing up on his skis, skiing down a mountain, on a mission. Maddie's nowhere to be found. And on top of that, he didn't have his backpack and he didn't have his gun. Had no idea how long he'd been skiing for. He didn't know where he was going. It was like he went from passed out to skiing, just magically skiing. Now, realistically, at this point, Aimo is thinking to himself, clearly what's happening here is I'm hallucinating or something. Because how is it possible that I was just with Maddie laying on the ground sleeping and now I'm here? It didn't add up. And so as he's just sort of mindlessly skiing along, he's telling himself this is you dying. This is you losing your mind before you die. Your mind is all over the place. Your body's still going for reasons he didn't really understand. Still at, full tilt, full energy, didn't know why. But at some point that's going to give out and you're just going to die. That's what's going to happen here. And so Aimo's only hope was that between now and when he died, that hopefully somebody would see him and save him. He knew it was an outside chance, but at this point, that's all he had. And so on he skied. No weapon, no backpack, no supplies. He's basically operating on no sleep, and he's just skiing. And for days and days, he doesn't stop. He can't believe his body is keeping up as well as it is. His mind is totally gone, but he is just going for days and days and days. Doesn't run into anyone. But then one day, again, days later, he's skiing along and magically almost in front of him appears this building. He can't tell if it's necessarily a military outpost or civilian. He doesn't know if it's Finnish or German or Soviet. But he knows, even in his totally fractured mental state, that attempting to go in that building and hoping there are people in there that will save him, even if they won't, even if they kill him maybe, that is a better outcome, a better choice than doing what he's doing right now, which is the sort of endless ski to his death. And so Aimo starts skiing faster and faster towards this building, just like full reckless abandon, fully committed to this is my rescue or this is my death. And as he gets closer, he sees, sort of unbelievably, that this is a military installation, and it is a German military installation. And remember, the Finnish are allied with the Germans at this point, and so this is a safe place for him. And so he's so relieved, he can't believe he's gonna potentially survive this thing. He takes off his skis and he starts running towards the front door of this building. But before he gets to the front door, he steps on something, and then there is a loud bang, and he's thrown into the air and comes crashing down. And when Aimo opened his eyes and sort of took stock of what had happened, he didn't feel any pain. But he looked down and he saw his foot was just a bloody mess. There was literally bones poking out of his ankle. Like he could see, clearly he sustained a horrible injury and he must have just stepped on a landmine. But Aimo, determined to get into that building, he pulled himself up, again sort of channeling this unbelievable just endurance he had been feeling the past several days that he'd been out here. He stood up and on one foot began hobbling his way towards this installation. And he finally gets to the front door of this German military base. And he grabs the doorknob and he's about to open it when there's another banging sound and he's thrown again into the air. He had stepped on another landmine. And he comes smashing down and he doesn't die. He doesn't feel any pain. But he looks down at his legs and he sees his other leg that was not injured a minute ago is now also mangled. So now he can't even stand. He's incapacitated. And on top of that, even though he's near this military outpost, he turns and looks at it. And now that he's a little bit closer and he's sort of looking more, intentionally at this building, he realizes it's abandoned. Like this isn't going to save him. He's trapped. He's in the middle of nowhere and there's no one here. And so at this point, Aimo just said, you know what? It's over. Like, I'm gonna die. And so he literally just crawled his way over to this nearby ditch, let himself roll into it, and he just waited to die. He just knew it was over. But he didn't die. For days, he just laid in this ditch, like unable to die. He wanted to die. He wanted this to be over. Like, what else is he gonna do? Who's gonna save him? But he just watched the sun come up and set. Go up, set, over and over and over. He lost track of how many days he was just laying there, again, bleeding profusely, like grievously injured. He hasn't eaten anything. He hasn't had any water. Like he can't believe he's still alive. He really can't believe it. And then as he's laying there, one of these days, he's just in this ditch. He looks up during the daytime and he sees what looks like a plane flying overhead. Now, at this point, Aimo is in very bad shape. I mean, he's alive, but it's not going well. And he knows that, so he doesn't know if he's hallucinating this or what, but he felt like it was real. But after watching this plane circle overhead for a minute, Aimo was almost certain he heard the sound of this plane landing nearby. And then a couple of minutes later, he could have sworn from the ditch, he can't really see anything, he could hear the sound of people speaking in Finnish, his native language. Again, he didn't know if he was hallucinating or not, but he sees this head poke over the top of the ditch. And it was this young man, this young Finnish guy, and he's looking down at Aimo, and Aimo's looking back up at him. And then a second later, Aimo was being pulled out of the ditch. Later that day, Aimo found himself laying in a hospital bed inside of a hospital in Finland. Like the man and the plane, all that, not a hallucination. He really had been rescued. And once he was at the hospital, it turned out he weighed just 94 pounds. He was also badly burned and frostbitten, and both of his legs were very badly mutilated and mangled. And his heart was beating at a staggering 200 beats per minute, despite the fact he's just laying in bed, not doing anything. And even more crazy was they couldn't actually get his heart to slow down. It just kept beating at this crazy high level. Now, at first, doctors and nurses and all the staff were like really shocked by Aimo's condition. Not really just that he had survived, but again, like his heart rate. Like it just seemed like, dude, how are you alive right now? Like your heart can't beat at this level for this long without eventually killing you. But after they spoke to Aimo and had him recount the whole ordeal of him being out, getting shot at and lost and the whole thing, they learned one really specific thing that explained the whole thing. When Imo and his, Finnish comrades were initially ambushed by the Soviet soldiers, they decided to flee. But Imo, he was having such a hard time physically keeping up with the other soldiers. Like, he was just getting so tired from trying to break the tracks, and then he fell off, and he's thinking to himself, if I don't find a way to keep up, I'm gonna get captured or get killed by the Soviets. And so he's desperate. And so before he ultimately crashed down the side of the mountain from exhaustion, he tried something to try to give himself some energy, to try to make this escape. He pulled out these special military rations that he had been issued, along with everybody else in his squadron. They were all given these rations. And the reason you take these rations is to give yourself some energy. And so he takes these rations, and he's thinking, this is gonna do it. This is gonna give me the boost I need to get out of here and make the escape with my teammates. But the rations didn't work. And so he did sort of completely fall off. He was so tired to the point where he literally tumbled down the side of the mountain. His teammates, they skied off, and he smashes into a tree and he passes out. However, when Imo woke up, one, he was amazed he had not been captured or killed by the Soviets, but he's realizing he's all alone and what's going to happen to me? And then he starts to feel like, man, I just have a lot of energy. I can see and perceive things on a level that I couldn't before. Well, that's because the military rations had kicked in. And now he had this abundance of energy. And it allowed him to basically ski indefinitely without sleeping, without having water, without food. He gets blown up twice. His feet have been blown off, basically. He's laying in a ditch dying, but he just can't seem to die. I mean, the guy should have died several times, but these rations did their job. They gave him all the energy he needed to survive this crazy, crazy 2 weeks in the wild. Well, the military rations, they're called Pervitin. And this drug, I don't know if it's still given to soldiers now, but probably not, because effectively what Pervitin is just pure crystal meth. And so in essence, Imo survived in the wild for all this time because he was on just a pure meth-fueled rage. He was just completely high for 2 weeks, and it saved his life. One thing to note about Pervitin is it does have two distinct downsides. One, it is incredibly addictive. And two, it creates really, really intense hallucinations. And so very likely, he did not come across his own battalion who then opened fire on him. He did not come across Maddie, his teammate out in the wild who told him to lay down. And who knows, we're not even sure if the military installation he saw was real. Very likely all of that was just in his mind. However, the landmines, those were real. Somewhat unbelievably, Imo would make a full recovery. And he would go on to get married, he would have 9 children, and he would live to the age of 71. And as grateful as he was to the drug that did save his life, he never took Pervitin again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today we have 2 stories that are each about people who really craved attention or status. But instead of getting that, they got carnage. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get new tires for the Like Button's car. But don't tell them you're replacing their regular tires with monster truck tires. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. so there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska. And even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate, and so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. He really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. That really was sort of his general stance on everything. That's really what inspired him to do any of this in the first place. In fact, this particular column that Derek was writing was about how he was advocating for abolishing a set of state and federal laws that were trying to control personal choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th. And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with 2 of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by. But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to, brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column. But he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top, the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch. And before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the west coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you gotta act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all-expenses-paid-for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. That is fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Scatino and his girlfriend, Dominica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he had heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had 2 just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Dominica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Dominica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties. But he was having so much fun with Dominica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, he realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Dominica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So, suddenly with a big smile on his face, he told Dominica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time, so this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. I mean, this was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." And she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt, and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life.
I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous, but now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other, and Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian, but then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him, and he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, he shoved his way through the crowd to the railing, over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was. But he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, he could see right in front of him the full horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. He was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3. He was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain, and when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull, which immediately flooded the ship. And then making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
In 1953, a man had just moved into a new apartment in London, and as soon as he went inside, he decided he wanted to renovate. And so he started by pulling down all the wallpaper in the kitchen. And as he's doing it, he makes his way into the kitchen pantry, and he pulls off one particular strip of wallpaper, and he sees behind the wallpaper, towards the bottom of the wall, is a door. There is a secret door behind the wallpaper. So he gets down and he rips off more of the wallpaper, and then he grabs the little handle and he pulls the door open. And what he sees inside of this little room was not only horrifying and would scar him for life, but the contents of this secret room would change the legal system in the United Kingdom forever. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, when the like button asks you to spray sunscreen on their back, gladly agree, but instead of sunscreen, use blue spray paint. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. The crime that would eventually put Timothy Evans on death row was horrific. But when you take a look at Timothy Evans's past, it's not really a shocker that his life played out the way that it did. Before Timothy was even born in 1924 in the southern end of Wales, his father had abandoned him and his siblings and his mother. And because Timothy's mother made almost no money, when Timothy was born, he was effectively born into poverty. As a young child, Timothy really struggled to learn how to speak properly, and then in school, he just really struggled to keep up with his peers. To make matters worse, when Timothy was 8 years old, he contracted tuberculosis of the skin on the underside of his right foot. This condition is not necessarily fatal, but it causes these large, painful blisters that take a really long time to go away, even with treatment. And because Timothy's outbreak was on the underside of his foot, it made walking nearly impossible. And so for a few years, starting when he was 8 years old and he was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the skin, Timothy had to miss huge chunks of his schooling to get medical treatment. And then other times he was missing school simply because he couldn't walk. And considering how poorly Timothy was already doing in school, these huge extended absences were totally catastrophic for his education. In fact, later in life, it would be determined that Timothy's IQ, which is a way to measure people's intelligence, was somewhere between 60 and 70, which is very low and put him in the range of having an intellectual disability. Not long after his tuberculosis of the skin diagnosis, Timothy would remain in school despite all of these absences and despite how difficult it was for him, but his real focus would shift from getting an education to trying to find work in order to help provide for his family, who were very poor. And Timothy was willing to do just about anything for money. For example, when he was only 13 years old, he became a coal miner, one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet at the time and still today. But despite Timothy's willingness to do these really challenging jobs that often paid very little, he would always eventually get fired, or he just would not get the job in the first place. He would be rejected. And always it was because either one, he had a flare-up of his tuberculosis on his foot, which made it impossible to walk, and so he couldn't go to and from his job, and so he'd be let go, or it would be because of his illiteracy, and the job just could not take someone in that could not read, write, or really even speak very well. Or in some cases, like when Timothy tried to join the military when he was 18 years old, and World War II was raging and all of his peers are going off to fight the war, well, when he tried to enlist, the military said, we can't take you because you are illiterate and because of your foot. This constant cycle of rejection and embarrassment really made Timothy quite cynical. He felt like he just didn't belong anywhere. And so at some point, perhaps as a coping mechanism, Timothy began to lie. He'd make up tall tales about the adventures he'd been on and all the influential people he knew and the superhuman skills he possessed. Now, most people who knew Timothy didn't believe any of the stories he told, but every now and again, some people actually did. And for Timothy, that little sliver of respect he would get in that moment, even though it was built on a lie, on an illusion, it was incredible for him. He didn't get that anywhere else in his life, and so he kind of became addicted to telling these lies. Fast forward to 1947, Timothy was 23 years old, and he was still living with his family, who had left Wales and had moved to London, and they were living in a very, very poor and dangerous neighborhood. At the time, Timothy had managed to get a job as a delivery driver and had yet to be fired from it, and on one of his daily routes around the city, he wound up meeting an 18-year-old girl named Beryl Thorley, who he really took a liking to. Now, according to people who knew Beryl, she apparently, like Timothy, had a very low IQ. And so Beryl and Timothy, they meet on one of Timothy's routes, and they immediately hit it off and they start dating. And by the end of that year, they were married. They initially lived inside of Timothy's family's apartment, but when Beryl became pregnant in early 1948, she and Timothy pooled what little money they had, and they got an apartment of their own. Their new apartment was terrible. It was tiny, it was dirty, it was located in an even more dangerous neighborhood than where Timothy's family lived, but it was good enough for them, at least at first. Once Beryl gave birth to their daughter, Geraldine, suddenly their cramped living quarters seemed impossibly small for a family of 3. And they were already extremely tight on money, and now adding a baby to the mix, they really just did not have enough money to survive. Timothy immediately tried picking up extra work wherever he could, but once again, his illiteracy and his foot, or a combination of the two, held him back. And so it wasn't long before the couple was forced to start taking out these awful high-interest loans that they knew they would never be able to pay back. So they are permanently saddled with debt. They know it. And these loans are only enough to barely get by. This is not enough to move out. This is only enough to stay in their squalid and awful conditions. And so as their debt piled up, in conjunction with all the stresses of being new parents and living in this really cramped space, it wasn't long before Beryl and Timothy's marriage just totally started to erode. It started with daily arguing over one of their many hardships, but it quickly escalated to full-blown physical confrontation that often was so loud that passerby outside in the very busy street would hear, coming from the 3rd floor, Timothy and Beryl screaming and yelling and punching each other, to the point where people outside literally stopped and just looked up, wondering what was going on up there. As Timothy's world seemed to just kind of crumble all around him, he at first turned to a coping mechanism he had used for most of his life, and that was just to lie about his current situation. He would tell people who would listen that he and his wife and his kid were doing great and everything was fine. But, behind closed doors, that wasn't true at all, and so that coping mechanism really didn't do a lot for him. And so Timothy eventually turned to alcohol to cope with his misery. But the alcohol would only make the situation worse because it was yet another thing for his wife to be mad at him about, and he was depressed all the time, and it was eating away at their non-existent budget to pay for all this alcohol. And so Timothy would turn to yet another source for comfort, but it would be a very unlikely source of comfort. It would be his downstairs neighbor, John Christie. And the reason his downstairs neighbor was so unlikely was because John could not have been more different from Timothy. John was nearly double Timothy's age. He was incredibly smart, and he was respected not only by his peers, but really by the community. And that respect came from the fact that John had served during World War I and been right on the front lines, and had nearly been killed during a mustard gas attack when he was fighting in the trenches. And then after the war was over, John would come back to London, and he would become a police constable for quite a while, and then after retiring from the force, he became a post office clerk. But despite John and Timothy's vast differences, there was one thing they had in common: marital problems. John and his wife Ethel had gotten married back in 1920, so 4 years before Timothy had even been born. But at some point early on in their marriage, the couple had split up. They didn't get divorced, but they separated, and they lived totally apart for a while. But in 1934, the couple would finally reconcile, and that's when they moved into the ground floor apartment of the apartment building that Timothy and Beryl would move into years later. So, years later, when John is sitting in his apartment and he can hear coming from the third floor, like everybody else in the general vicinity, the sound of Timothy and Beryl fighting like crazy up in their apartment, John decided, with his experience with reconciling with his wife, that he ought to reach out to that young man, Timothy, and offer him some advice, or at the very least, be a friendly sounding board. And so John would eventually strike up a conversation with Timothy one day when they were passing each other, and Timothy was at a place in his life where he was looking for friends. He didn't have any friends. And so John, to come into his life at this point, was really good for Timothy, and so very quickly those two struck up a friendship. But this friendship was not really peer-to-peer. It was more like father to son or mentor to mentee, where Timothy really looked up to John. I mean, Timothy had never had a father in his life, and so John kind of became that. And John looked at Timothy with a lot of empathy. He could tell this was a man who was, not very bright, and he was in way over his head with debt, with this marriage, with parenthood, everything. And so John tried hard to kind of coach and guide Timothy as he navigated this very rough time in his life. And their relationship likely could have had a really positive effect, not only on just Timothy's mental health, but also perhaps on the state of Timothy and Beryl's marriage. But it was not long after John met Timothy that Timothy found out Beryl was pregnant with a second child. This was terrible news for Timothy. He knew they absolutely could not afford another child. As it was, they couldn't afford the current child they had. They couldn't afford anything. And in the United Kingdom, abortions were illegal, so there was no way to terminate this pregnancy. And so, totally desperate and terrified, Timothy turned to John for guidance. And John would later recall on the witness stand during Timothy's trial that, John did his best to try to console and comfort and tell Timothy that everything was going to be okay. You'll get another job. You'll take out another loan. It'll all work out. But, as John would say on the witness stand, his words didn't have any effect on Timothy. Timothy, by the time he came to John, was totally inconsolable, he was desperate, and he was unhinged. And so John started to suspect that Timothy might do something really drastic to make his troubles go away. And John would be correct. While you lay in bed at night and you're looking up at your plastic glow-in-the-dark stars that line your ceiling, do you ever pull the blankets up to your chin and snuggle down and secretly wish to yourself, man, if I could just one time see the world-famous traditional Chinese chime bell player Post Malone clack his bells live in concert just once, my life would be made. Or, if that's not you, maybe you're the type that walks around all day imagining what it would be like to up close and personal hear with your own ears the sweet melodies from world-renowned bassoonist Dave Matthews. Well, today, fantasy becomes reality with SeatGeek. SeatGeek is a ticketing app that makes buying tickets to these incredible exclusive events super easy. Just last week, using their sweet app, I snagged front row tickets to Celine Dion's special tuba and snare drum performance. But whatever you're into, whether it's music, sports, comedy, festivals, SeatGeek has the tickets. Also, SeatGeek wants you to get an excellent deal. So when you're on their app, if you see green dots, that means good deal. You see red dots, that means bad deal. And today, SeatGeek is offering a great deal to all of you. Use code MrBallen for $20 off tickets at SeatGeek. That's $20 off your first purchase with promo code MrBallen. Make sure you click the link in the description to download the app. A few weeks later, on November 30th, 1949, a very disheveled-looking Timothy wandered into a local police station in Wales, not far from where he had grown up, and he would confess to the police that he had killed his wife. He would tell the police that he had given Beryl a poison that was apparently designed to abort her fetus, but this poison was too strong and it had killed Beryl. And then after she was dead, Timothy said he panicked, and so he took her body and he dumped her down the sewer that was outside of their apartment building. And then he arranged for his daughter, Geraldine, to go stay with some people in London while Timothy fled to Wales. But after getting to Wales, Timothy said his guilty conscience was just too much, and so he turned himself in. The police immediately arrested Timothy and they brought him back to London. And then once he was in a cell in London,
London detectives went out to Timothy's apartment building, and they went to the manhole cover that led down into the sewer that was right outside of the apartment building, and right away they noticed something odd. They were not able to get the lid off of the sewer. It was just too heavy. It would move, but one man couldn't do it. And so after 3 police officers, they all got down, they were barely able to get this lid up and off of the top of the sewer. And then when they went down into the sewer, there was no body. There was nothing down there. And so when detectives went back to Timothy in the London jail cell and they confronted him with this revelation that, no, she's not in there, Timothy would kind of squirm a little bit, and then he would totally change his story. He would tell police that it was not he who gave Beryl this poison that ended up killing her. It was his friend and mentor and father-like figure in his life, John Christie. Timothy also told police that he left his daughter, Geraldine, in the care of John. Police are skeptical of Timothy, but because there's a child involved, they just immediately take his story at face value and they rush back to the apartment building and they knock on John's door, and John opens the door and he's standing there with his wife Ethel, and he's totally shocked at these accusations that have been lodged against him by who he thought was a very close friend of his. And John and Ethel would tell police that not only did they have no clue what happened to Beryl, but Geraldine had never been in their care. And so the police are immediately very concerned for Geraldine's well-being. You know, who has Geraldine? Where is she? But while they were there, they just did a thorough search of John and Ethel's property to make sure they weren't lying. And then after searching their property, there was nothing inside. But when police left John and Ethel's apartment and began searching the outside of the property, an area that they had briefly searched when they were there earlier, looking in the sewer, but now they're doing a much more thorough search. And during this thorough search, they find this shed that was located in the backyard of this big apartment building. And inside of this shed, wrapped in blankets, are the bodies of Beryl and her 13-month-old daughter, Geraldine. They had both been strangled to death. After processing the crime scene, the police went back to the jail where Timothy was being held, and they would tell him what they discovered at the property, and Timothy had a very muted response to it. And then when one of the detectives asked Timothy point blank, "Are you responsible for both your wife and your daughter's deaths?" Timothy would say yes. And then during a follow-on interrogation, Timothy would confess that he had been in a heated argument with his wife over money, and at some point during this fight, which got very physical, he strangled Beryl to death. And then 2 days later, he strangled his daughter to death. And then after dumping their bodies in that shed outside, he fled to Wales. Timothy would actually recant that final confession, but it really didn't matter because when he went to trial a little over a month later, the jury just did not believe that Timothy did not do it. And so very quickly, they convicted him of murder and they sentenced him to death. Just 3 months after his conviction, so on March 9th, 1950, Timothy would find himself sitting inside of the so-called condemned suite at Pentonville Prison in London. He was shackled to this table with guards sitting on either side of him in this very small cell. And then right next to him was this wall that kind of ran down the side of the cell. And on the other side of that wall was the execution chamber. And so as Timothy would have been sitting at this table, suddenly the cell door that led into the holding area would have flung open. The execution team would have rushed in and grabbed Timothy and stood him up before he could run or fight back. And then before he knew it, he'd be pushed over to the door that went through that wall into the execution chamber. Once that door was open, Timothy only would have had maybe a couple of seconds to take in what he saw. And it would have been this pale green square room with a noose dangling down from the ceiling. And right below it was an obvious mechanical trap door. And off to the side of the room was a lever that the executioner would actually pull to open up that floor and send the prisoner falling down into the pit below. And so Timothy, he would have taken this in just for a second. His heart would have been racing, and before long, he would have been standing on this trapdoor. The noose would have come down. They would have tightened it to his neck. A bag would have been placed over his head. All the guards would have pushed to the walls, and then before Timothy could even say or do anything, the lever was pulled, and he dropped down into a 12-foot deep brick-lined pit where he would dangle by his neck until he died. This gruesome ending should have been the end of an already very gruesome story, but it wasn't.
Not even close. 3 years after Timothy's execution, a man named Beresford Brown moved into the same ground floor apartment that John Christie and Ethel had shared. John had moved out just a couple of days earlier. And so Beresford, he moves into this apartment. It's totally dirty. It's not well kept. And so Beresford decides that he's going to fix the place up. And the first thing he's going to do is he's going to tear down all of the old wallpaper in the kitchen and replace it. And so he goes into the kitchen, he starts tearing down the wallpaper, he makes his way into the kitchen pantry, he starts pulling the wallpaper down in there, and at some point when he pulls one strip of paper all the way to the ground, he sees towards the bottom of this wall inside of his pantry where there are no shelves over it, behind the wallpaper, there is obviously a door, just a small door. It almost looks like the entrance to a crawl space. And so Beresford is totally intrigued, why would there be this door behind the wallpaper in the pantry? And so he rips off the remaining wallpaper over this little door. He finds the handle and he forces it open. And what he sees inside of that little room would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 years and 4 months earlier, when Timothy discovered that his wife Beryl was pregnant with their second child, Timothy really did go to his friend John for guidance. However, this is where the story takes a turn. When Tim came to John, who was medically trained from his time in the military, he would tell Tim, hey, I can perform an abortion on Beryl if you want me to. Timothy immediately thought this was a great idea. And so totally relieved, thinking his problems are now all solved, he left John's apartment and ran upstairs to his own. He told Beryl about how John could perform this procedure for them. Did she want to do it? And Beryl said, yeah, let's do it. Now, we don't know exactly what happened next, but the running theory is that sometime in November of 1949, Beryl and Geraldine left their apartment on the 3rd floor and went down to the 1st floor, John's apartment, and when they got there, it was just John. John's wife Ethel, she was gone for the day. As for Timothy, he also was not present for this procedure, but he likely knew it was happening. So Beryl and Geraldine, they walk inside of John's apartment, and pretty quickly, Beryl finds a place, or maybe John finds a place to put Geraldine in the apartment where she's safe. And then John ushers Beryl over to this chair. It's like his makeshift medical chair, and he tells her to have a seat. So she sits down, and John goes over and gets this device. And now this device, it looks like a glass jar filled with clear liquid, and then poking out of either side of it are these black, thin, hollow tubes that come out and connect at this kind of makeshift mouthpiece. And so John, he walks over with this device, and he hands the mouthpiece portion of this device to Beryl, and he says, here, put this on your mouth and start breathing it in. There's a gas I produce that kind of numbs the pain as I do this procedure to you. And so Beryl did as she was told. She took this mouthpiece and she put it over her mouth and her nose, and she began breathing deeply. And as she did that, John grabbed a chemical and he began slowly pouring it into the glass jar where these tubes were coming out of. And as he did that, a white gas began to form above the liquid inside of the jar, and there was a cover over the top of this jar. So the gas was trapped inside of this jar, and as Beryl is taking these big breaths through those tubes, she's sucking that gas into her lungs. And very quickly, as she's breathing on this apparatus, she didn't start feeling numb, she just passed out completely. However, this was John's plan all along. That device he made her put on her face, that was only designed to make people pass out. It was not to numb any pain. John was not medically trained. He was not performing abortions out of his apartment. He was a serial killer. So with Beryl now unconscious in front of him, John did the same thing he did to the other 2 women he had lured into his trap and whose bodies were now buried in his backyard. He began having his way with Beryl. And at some point during this assault, Beryl woke up and began trying to fight off John, but he overpowered her and he strangled her to death. And then after she was dead, John just walked into the other room where Geraldine was, and he used a shirt tie and he wrapped it around Geraldine's neck and he strangled her to death. And then after that, he put the mother and daughter together in some sheets and he put them out in the shed in the backyard. Later, when Timothy came to John's apartment to see how the procedure had gone on his wife, John would tell Timothy that, sorry, it didn't work out and your wife is dead. Don't worry, I'll look after your daughter and make sure she's taken care of. You need to flee London and go to Wales now. And so Timothy, without really asking any questions, would do as he was told and he would flee to Wales. But a little while later, when he tried to check in with John about how his daughter was doing, because he had no idea where she was or who she was with, John would just not let Timothy see her. And so Timothy eventually, just feeling racked with guilt about this whole situation, he went to police. And critically, when he spoke to police, he lied about what happened. He wanted to protect his friend John, who he looked at as a father figure, as a mentor, as a close friend. And so he said, I killed my wife. And so this is why Timothy got the location of his wife's body wrong, because he didn't know. He just guessed the sewer. And so that explains why when they got over to the sewer, not only was it empty, but it seemed totally impossible that anybody could have lifted this manhole cover on their own. It was too heavy. Then, after police discovered Beryl and Geraldine's body, and they went back to the London jail and told Timothy, that was the first time he found out what had happened to his daughter. Because to that point, Tim really did believe that John had just been taking care of Geraldine, or John had handed off his child to somebody else who was taking care of Geraldine. But either way, Geraldine was okay. So he's just been told she's not okay, she's dead as well. His whole family is gone. And so Tim was almost certainly in shock. And so he's sitting there with that sort of muted response as detectives are asking him, are you responsible for your wife and your child's death? And so Tim would say yes, but it's unclear if Tim actually understood their question or if he understood the implications of their question. He might have just been saying, I feel guilty about the fact that my family is dead, not that he literally killed both his wife and daughter. But when Tim finally kind of snapped out of it and really began trying to tell the truth that John was responsible, nobody believed him because his credibility was totally destroyed, because the first thing he did when he went to police was lie about what happened. And when police dug into Timothy's history a little bit, they saw he was a compulsive liar. Everybody said, oh, Timothy tells tall tales, that's just what he does. And making things even worse for Timothy was the fact that he had a very clear motive for why he might harm his family. He was under crippling debt, and his relationship with his wife was incredibly toxic and often became physical, and there were lots of witnesses to that. During Timothy's trial, despite the fact that Timothy and his lawyers tried everything they could to point the finger at John Christie, saying, no, he's the guy responsible, because John was constantly on the witness stand and had this impeccable resume as this war hero and this police constable, and he was well respected and he was well spoken and he was smart, the jury completely believed him. He was the epitome of credible, whereas Timothy was the opposite. And so it was largely John, the real killer's testimony that actually put Timothy, the innocent man, on death row. Also, the police totally botched the investigation from the beginning, because the police went into the investigation already completely convinced that Timothy was guilty. This was an open and shut case, and us gathering evidence and doing all this didn't really matter because Timothy was the guy. And so because the police were so focused on Timothy, they were blind to really obvious things all around them. For example, during their several searches of the apartment complex, both inside and out, a dog ran into the backyard and actually dug up one of the skeletons from one of those two women that John had killed years earlier and buried out there. And so a human skull and a human leg bone were visible outside as police are walking around. John was able to grab the skull and chuck it next door into a burned out building, but the leg bone was literally propped up against the side of the backyard in plain view. Nobody caught it. The police are also believed to have coerced Timothy into signing his final confession, where he says, I not only killed my wife, but I also killed my daughter. There's even some speculation that the police literally signed it for him, that they forged the entire document. And so Timothy gets hauled off and executed. Meanwhile, John, the real killer, just keeps on killing. He would murder at least 4 more women, including his wife, Ethel, using the same technique, the gas machine followed by strangulation. And it was during the time that he killed these last 4 victims that we know about that John became increasingly turned on by death itself. And so that was why he stuffed his wife's body right underneath the floorboards in his kitchen, and he stuffed those other 3 women inside of that tiny little room behind that secret door in the pantry, so that all day long as he was in his apartment, it constantly smelled of decomposing flesh. After Beresford Brown opened that secret door in the kitchen pantry and discovered those 3 women's bodies smashed inside of there, he would tell the police, and then 10 days later, on March 31st, 1953, John Christie would be found and arrested. He would confess to killing all 8 victims, but the police only had enough evidence to charge him with 1 murder, and that was the murder of his wife, Ethel. But he was found guilty of that, and it was enough to warrant a death sentence. On July 15th of that year, at about 9 a.m., John Christie found himself sitting in the same condemned suite at Pentonville Prison that Timothy Evans had been sitting in 3.5 years earlier. Then, moments later, the door behind John opened up. The same execution team that killed Timothy Evans came inside. They grabbed John, they hoisted him up, they moved him over to the door that led into the execution chamber. The door flung open and John got his first look at the gallows. They rushed him over to the middle of the room. They pulled the noose down, tied it tight around his neck. They put the bag down over his head. All the guards stepped to the side. And then right as the executioner is about to pull down the lever, John, out of the blue, says, "Wait, my nose itches." To which the executioner just said, "It won't bother you for long." And then he pulled the switch. Due in large part to the massive injustice in this case, where an obviously innocent man was carted off and executed, the UK would suspend the death penalty in 1965, and then in 1969, they would abolish it entirely. Between those 2 dates, in 1966, Timothy would receive a posthumous pardon for the murder of his family, meaning he is officially an innocent man. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, when the like button asks you to spray sunscreen on their back, gladly agree, but instead of sunscreen, use blue spray paint. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast that uploads exclusive content on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload remastered audio from our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is just called MrBallen's Podcast, and it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, basically anywhere you find podcasts, you can find this one. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen's Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most affected by violent and heinous crime. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Español. We also post near daily content on Facebook and Snapchat. Both of those channels are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Today, I'm going to tell you 3 medical mysteries. And all of these stories end with diagnoses that are so bizarre, they'll leave you thinking, I didn't even know that was possible. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the like button's laundry. Don't tell them you're going to do their laundry in their dishwasher. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in 2017, a 25-year-old man named Watanabe Takuya stumbled into the Keio University Hospital in Tokyo, Japan. Takuya felt sweaty and feverish, and his head was pounding. And he also had one hand kind of cupped over his right ear because his ear was literally leaking fluid. But Takuya was not scared by these symptoms. Instead, he actually felt sort of annoyed because this was actually not the first time these symptoms had happened to him. So Takuya had this long history of something known as cholesteatoma, which is basically a recurring cyst that grows deep inside the ear canal. When he was a teenager, he'd had multiple surgeries to have this cyst removed and keep it from coming back. And for almost a decade now, it had seemed like the surgeries had worked because the cyst had stayed gone. But about 2 weeks earlier, he'd begun having this constant drainage coming out of his ear, which was, a sign that the cyst was back. Now, when this began happening, initially he had sort of put off going back to the hospital, but now he was pretty sure the cyst had caused him to develop an ear infection, which would now explain his fever and his headache, and so here he was. So Takuya made his way to the check-in desk at the hospital with one hand still kind of keeping the liquid in his ear, and as he's standing there, he explained his symptoms and his medical history to the receptionist, who nodded, took down all of his information, and quickly admitted him to the emergency room. About half an hour later, Takuya was laying in his emergency room bed with his eyes closed because the light in the room was so intense it was, making his headache worse. But even with his eyes closed, he knew there was a hospital doctor standing right beside his bed. And he listened as the doctor went over the results of some of the tests they had run. The doctor said that based on Takuya's medical history and the fluid clearly leaking out of his ear, they were pretty sure that he was right and that his cyst had returned and led to what was now a severe ear infection. He said that very likely Takuya would have to have another surgery to get rid of the cyst again. But the doctor didn't want to operate just yet because he said they had an even bigger problem to deal with first. Based on the preliminary blood tests, the doctor said it looked like Takuya's ear infection had gotten so bad that the infection had actually spread to the tissue surrounding his brain. And this was obviously extremely dangerous, primarily because it could lead to permanent brain damage and even death. And when Takuya heard this, on one hand, he was obviously shocked. This was more than he expected, of course. But more than that, he just felt mad at himself because he knew that if he hadn't waited so long to come to the hospital, this infection likely wouldn't have gotten this bad. He's known about this for 2 weeks. He just kind of didn't want to deal with it, and now it was obviously much worse. But regardless, it was too late now. So Takuya, despite the light, opened up his eyes and he asked the doctor, what could they do? And the doctor said they were going to have to admit him to the hospital, not just the emergency room, and start him on a very powerful dose of antibiotics. 2 weeks later, Takuya was still in the hospital. And at this point, he was actually lying on his back and he was being basically rolled inside of a CT machine, which basically is like this big white ring that goes over your head and it scans the inside of your head. So by this point, the antibiotics he'd been prescribed had worked and Takuya's infection had been cured. But despite that, his ear was still leaking fluid on and off, not constantly, but it was definitely still happening. So because of that, hospital doctors had ordered this CT scan specifically so they could look inside of Takuya's head and basically map out exactly how they were going to operate on his ear. Takuya laid perfectly still for about 5 minutes while the CT scan machine took pictures of the inside of his head. And then when it was done, a nurse pulled him out and then led him back to his hospital room. And then a little while later, a hospital doctor came into the room holding some papers, and the doctor told Takuya that, based on the CT scan he had just done, he actually didn't need another surgery on his ear. And immediately, Takuya felt so happy and so relieved because he thought, another surgery was practically inevitable. But that happy feeling only lasted for about a second. Because then the doctor, who, just delivered this news, sort of shifted and had this really troubled look come over his face. And they told Takuya that, the reason you don't need another surgery is because there is no cyst in your ear at all. The real problem that was causing all of your symptoms was much, much worse. Then, from his stack of papers, the doctor handed Takuya an image from the CT scan. And when Takuya looked at it, he could not believe what he saw. It would turn out Takuya had an extremely rare condition called Gorham-Stout disease, which is more commonly known as vanishing bone disease. It happens when a person's body just randomly starts breaking down and consuming their own bones. And in Takuya's case, his skull was now literally disappearing, almost like a melting ice cube. And that fluid that was leaking out of his ear was brain fluid that was now basically flowing through the holes in his skull. Now, unfortunately, at the time of the story, and still today, there is no known cure for Gorham-Stout disease. The best doctors can do is basically plug up the holes where they begin to disintegrate. And that's exactly what they did for Takuya. They used this special glue and literally kind of plugged up the holes in his skull. But amazingly, it sort of worked because Takuya's doctors monitored him for bone loss and fluid leakage after they did this, and as of his most recent checkup in 2018, at least in terms of what's been publicly released, he appeared to be doing quite well. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballenstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballenstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. Again, that's fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. One afternoon in late January of 2018, a father named Dan Levitas stood inside the bathroom that his three kids shared inside of his house in Madison, Wisconsin. Dan grabbed his kids' toothbrushes and threw them right in the garbage. Then he sprayed the counters, the sink, the mirror, basically every surface he could see with disinfectant and began wiping everything down. So Dan was doing this because he, his wife, and their three kids all had strep throat. And according to their doctor, the best way to get rid of it was basically to have everybody take antibiotics and to deep clean the house to get rid of all the bacteria that had caused the infection. However, as Dan, followed protocol and scrubbed down the bathroom counters, he felt sort of frustrated because this was not actually the first time that his whole family had come down with strep. Over just the last 4 months, his whole family had gotten strep 6 times. And no matter how many antibiotics they took or how many times they deep cleaned the house and all the bathrooms, it's like they always got sick again. And this was really baffling to Dan because he was actually a biologist, and so he knew a lot about bacteria. And he'd already explored practically every option for where this repeated strep infection could be coming from. Nobody else at his or his wife's work was getting sick, and neither was anybody at his kid's school or daycare, so he knew it couldn't be coming from any of those places. But this didn't make any sense either, because each time they got strep, all 6 times, Dan and his wife, systematically disinfected like the entire house. I mean, really overboard, cleaning every surface. So if there was bacteria somewhere in the house, it had to have been cleaned up by now. But it was like somehow the bacteria was surviving the disinfecting. He just didn't know where it could be. But regardless, Dan still dutifully went about, disinfecting the bathroom for the 6th time here. Then when he was done, he went into the kitchen where he had his whole family's antibiotic prescriptions stacked up on the counter. Dan took his own and then also grabbed doses for everybody else. Dan brought antibiotics to his 2 daughters, who were 6 and 3 years old, and who were also both lying in their beds looking completely miserable. Then he went into his and his wife's room, where he found his wife sitting up in bed, cuddling with their very sick 1-year-old son. Dan handed his wife the antibiotics and then looked down at his son. He looked so small and vulnerable, and it just killed Dan to think how many times this poor kid had been sick and how powerless he was to help him. Dan didn't know what else to do here. He and his wife were following doctor's orders here, but this is, again, the 6th time, and clearly nothing's changing, so the advice is not really helping. It just sort of felt like they were trapped and couldn't get out of this awful situation. But then, as Dan was standing there feeling sort of defeated, he thought of something. His mother was a retired pediatrician, and she might have different advice for how to handle this. So he sat down in bed, took out his phone, and he called his mom to ask for help. And Dan's mom actually did have a theory about where this strep bacteria was coming from and how to get rid of it. But because Dan was, a biologist and really understood how bacteria functioned, he knew her theory was sort of out there. Like most scientists and medical professionals for that matter would say that his mom's theory was basically not possible. But at this point, Dan and his family were desperate enough that they were all ready to try something new. So Dan decided he would try out his mother's theory. And so he began looking for an expert to help him do that. But all the experts Dan got in touch with, when they heard about what this theory really entailed, they turned it down. Like nobody was prepared to do this. And so for Dan, it felt like he was, right on the cusp of maybe finding the answer here and maybe curing, his family of this horrible problem. But no medical professionals would even entertain it as a possibility. About a month later, in early March, Dan was inside of a hospital room sitting next to his wife, and they were both staring down at their 3-year-old daughter. She was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to an IV and an oxygen mask, because she'd gotten strep throat for a 7th time. And this time, she'd gotten so sick, she'd also developed pneumonia. And so realistically, at this point, Dan and his wife weren't even sure if she was going to survive. And for Dan, he was on the verge of a complete breakdown here. He was convinced that the only way to protect his kids was to find somebody who would test his mother's theory, but Dan and his wife had already been turned down by basically every expert in the entire state. And so Dan really didn't know who to turn to at this point. But as they sat in the hospital room, watching their toddler fight for her life, Dan's wife suddenly turned to him and said, "What if instead of asking medical professionals for help, what if we try asking medical students? Maybe a student would be more willing to test out this theory, even if it did seem kind of crazy." Dan agreed. At this point, it was definitely worth a try. So they reached out to the University of Wisconsin. And this final Hail Mary actually worked. On April 4th, 2018, so about 6 months after the first strep outbreak in their house, Dan and his wife took one very specific thing from their home and brought it to the University of Wisconsin. The student they'd contacted then analyzed this thing and was determined after their analysis that Dan and his family's crazy theory was correct. It would turn out Dan, his wife, and their 3 kids were not the only ones in their home suffering from strep throat. There was actually a 6th victim, their pet cat. Now, most veterinarians didn't believe that cats could even catch strep, let alone transmit it to humans. So they all refused to test the family's cat. That's why they kept saying no. It was not until Dan contacted the University of Wisconsin Veterinary School that a student finally agreed to do it, and lo and behold, the test came back positive for the exact same strain that the family kept on catching. Their cat kept giving them strep. Dan's 3-year-old daughter would make a full recovery from her pneumonia, and after another round of antibiotics, including antibiotics for the cat, and one more deep clean of the house, the family's strep throat finally went away for good. On September 30th, 1964, a 44-year-old woman named Charlotte Lawrence stood with her husband outside the door to her parents' apartment in a little city in southwestern Germany. Charlotte took a deep, shaky breath and then unlocked the door and stepped slowly into her parents' home. So Charlotte was here because both of her parents had suddenly died just a few days ago. They'd only been 70 and 76 years old, and they had both been in good health. But her father had suffered a massive heart attack right in their kitchen, And when her mother found him, she also had a heart attack, apparently out of shock. Now, Charlotte's mother had managed to call a doctor, but by the time the doctor arrived, both Charlotte's dad and mom were deceased. Now, Charlotte and her husband had flown into Germany that morning from Wisconsin, where they lived. And up until this point, Charlotte really had been holding her emotions together. But now, standing in her parents' living room and looking around at all their belongings, it was like all of the grief just poured out of her, and she just broke down and sobbed. So her husband, not really knowing what else to do, just turned on the TV and sort of guided Charlotte over to the couch and told her to sit down and rest for a bit before they had dinner. They actually had plans that evening with the next door neighbor. She was this elderly woman named Caroline, and Caroline had offered to come over and cook dinner for them. And also Charlotte's uncle, Dieter, planned to come over as well after dinner since he lived nearby. About 30 minutes later, Charlotte is still sitting on the couch, just kind of relaxing and watching TV. Caroline, the neighbor, showed up, and she showed up with 2 big bags of groceries, and she went right inside the house and right into the kitchen and began cooking. And pretty soon, the entire apartment smelled like comfort food, which made Charlotte feel, admittedly, a lot better. Eventually, Caroline called out that dinner was almost ready. So at that point, Charlotte got up, she went into the kitchen and sat down at the table next to her husband. And then, after the food was served, they all ate dinner together while they waited for her uncle, Dieter, to arrive. Not long after, Uncle Dieter arrived and knocked on the front door of the apartment. But after a full minute, nobody came to the door. So he knocked again, but there was still no answer. Dieter could hear the TV on in the living room, but he couldn't hear any voices inside or the sound of anybody moving around inside the apartment. And so after a couple of minutes, he just decided he would let himself in. As Dieter walked through the living room, he began calling out for Charlotte, her husband, and for Caroline. But still, nobody called back, and there was no sound of anybody moving inside the apartment. It was just totally still. And so Dieter, he couldn't help but feel a little apprehensive, like, this is weird. Like, where is everybody? What's going on? They were expecting me. He walked out of the living room and into the kitchen, and there he saw Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline all sitting at the table, eating their food. But something was wrong. All 3 of them were just sitting at the table, and their plates were, half eaten right in front of them, but nobody was moving. It was like they were all just kind of stationary, just kind of staring straight ahead. And so Dieter, he bent down and he was like, Charlotte, what's going on? What are you guys doing? But when he got a good look at Charlotte's face and Caroline's face and Charlotte's husband's face, his stomach just dropped and he backed away, totally horrified. What Dieter saw was so terrifying, so eerie, so awful. It actually made international news. And that apartment would even get a nickname, the Death House. Charlotte's parents did not just have spontaneous heart attacks on the same day and die. That's not what happened. It would turn out that toxic sewer gas had been leaking into the apartment through a broken pipe in the kitchen sink. That gas poisoned both of Charlotte's parents and caused their hearts to stop, basically at the same time. Now, nobody thought to check for sewer gas poison, so Charlotte and her husband came to stay at her parents' apartment without any idea that the apartment was still full of this toxic gas. And so when Dieter finally came over for dinner, he found Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline all sitting around the kitchen table, sort of frozen there because they were dead. Dieter, fortunately, after seeing this, immediately left the apartment to go call the authorities, and it was that decision that ultimately saved his life.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On June 20th, 2004, a restaurant manager stood at the host stand of a seafood spot in Orange County, California. It was the dinner rush, and he was on takeout duty. So when a fairly frantic customer came in asking about their to-go order, the manager quickly hurried off to grab it. He found the order and he carried it back, and as he rang this customer up, he could tell this customer was in a huge hurry. They kept looking over their shoulder and tapping their fingers on the counter, and after everything was done, the customer basically took the food and literally ran out.
Now, the manager definitely thought this customer was acting really strange. He had never seen anybody sprint out of the restaurant before. But quickly, he got distracted with another order and kind of forgot about the whole thing. That is, until a few days later when police showed up, asking the manager to tell them everything they could remember about that strange customer. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button has a blinding headache, offer them some aspirin. But don't tell them it's actually just a very strong laxative. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Monday, June 21st, 2004, 72-year-old Jane Thompson drove her car down a road through the city of Laguna Niguel, California. She was on her way home from a weekend trip to Los Angeles, which was about 50 miles north of Laguna Niguel. And because LA was so chaotic and full of activity and constant stimulation, Jane actually really appreciated this commute back home, this 50-mile drive. It was a time to be by herself and sort of decompress from being in the city. So Jane used to live in Los Angeles, where she had worked for decades in the film industry. But she had retired and moved to Laguna Niguel 7 years earlier. And this move had been like a total lifestyle change for Jane, because her career in LA had been fast-paced and exciting. She'd been an assistant to some really important people in Hollywood, and then also she was an award-winning producer, and then a decorator for various Hollywood celebrities. It was sort of very glamorous what she was doing. So even though Jane was generally a pretty quiet person who appreciated her alone time, like driving in the car right now, it still had actually been really hard to completely transition to the slow pace of life outside the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, especially because her girlfriend, Marion Reese, still lived in LA. Jane had known Marion for decades at this point. They'd started out as coworkers because Marion owned a production company and Jane had produced a lot of projects for her. Then at some point years ago, their relationship turned from a, working friendship into a full-blown romance, and they'd been involved ever since. And even though now they lived over an hour's drive apart, they still spent a lot of time together. Jane was actually going back to LA again on Friday because they had tickets to the opera, and then also Marion was going to be joining Jane on a cruise to Europe the following week. But for right now, Jane just kind of looked out her window as she drove by a cluster of houses. And she noticed outside one of those houses, she saw her friend, Mary Larkin, gardening in her front yard. Jane had known Mary for years, and she was really Jane's closest friend in town. They'd spent countless nights talking and drinking wine together, sometimes with Mary's other next-door neighbor, Karen, who had also become a close friend. So, naturally, Jane slowed down in her car, and she rolled down her window, and she called out to Mary to say hello, and to remind her that they were due for a wine night sometime soon, before she left for her cruise. And Mary, after hearing this, nodded enthusiastically and said she would for sure give Jane a call. After that, the two women said their goodbyes, and then Jane kept on driving. And a few minutes later, Jane saw her condo complex's entrance up ahead, and so she threw on her blinker and turned in. And pretty soon, she was surrounded by mostly identical units with orange-tiled roofs that were all packed really close together. But Jane loved her neighborhood. It was on this quiet hillside and less than 4 miles from the ocean, and she just felt completely comfortable there. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, and everybody seemed so warm and welcoming. And this meant a lot to Jane, because she didn't have any kids or living relatives. She was kind of on her own. So it was nice to feel like her neighbors were all looking out for her. As Jane pulled her car into the garage and got out, she looked across the street and saw her teenage neighbor, Sam Nelson, playing basketball in his driveway. Jane tried to get his attention and waved to him just to say hi, but when he looked over and saw her doing that, he kind of put his head down and quickly rushed inside his home. And Jane, she understood why. Clearly, he was embarrassed. So Sam was kind of a troubled kid. He had actually broken into Jane's house just this past Friday while she was out, and he took some of her jewelry. But he wasn't as clever as he thought he was, and Jane had quickly figured out it was him. So before leaving for her recent LA trip, she'd confronted him about it and told him to never do it again. and he was obviously mortified. But she had also told Sam that, she was not going to call the police here. After all, Sam was 15 years old, and he had just made a really dumb mistake. And in Jane's mind, Sam was a part of her beloved community, and so even though he had done something bad to her, she still wanted to look out for him. Plus, really, he hadn't taken anything that was particularly valuable or anything she really cared about, so she felt like she was just giving him a second chance, and this was no big deal. Now, Sam was obviously very appreciative at the time after realizing he was, not going to get in any real trouble here. But it was also clear now that he really didn't want anything to do with Jane. I mean, he was just embarrassed at the sight of her waving to him. But, for Jane, she figured maybe that was just as well. And so, after seeing Sam disappear into his house, Jane just shrugged, turned around, and headed inside her own house. Jane spent the next few days doing things around town, volunteering at the library and taking walks with her weekly walking group. And before she knew it, it was almost time to head back to LA. On Thursday evening, June 24th, so the night before she was set to go to LA, Jane stood in her kitchen making some pasta and thinking about what outfit she was going to wear for the opera in LA the next night. And then after she cooked and ate her dinner, she laid on the couch to watch some TV. Now, she had planned to only watch a little bit and then get some packing done, but pretty quickly she felt her eyelids get heavy, and soon she was fast asleep. 3 days later, on Sunday afternoon, Jane's friend and neighbor, Mary Larkin, the woman she had seen when she was driving home from LA, drove up to Jane's house with their other friend, Karen Hamara, and they jumped right out of the car. Mary had an undeniable knot in her stomach, which had only been getting tighter by the minute ever since Jane's girlfriend, Marian Reese, had called earlier to say that Jane had never showed up in LA for their trip to the opera, and now she was not answering her phone. And when she heard this, Mary immediately became very worried because, Jane just didn't flake on people without calling. And so given Jane's age, it seemed entirely possible that maybe she had an accident or medical emergency at home and needed help, and that's why nobody could get in touch with her. So after she herself tried calling Jane a few times, but with no luck, Mary had gone over to her neighbor Karen's house and asked her if she would come with her to go to Jane's house, just to make sure Jane was okay. And on their drive over, Mary had convinced herself, despite that feeling in her gut, that, everything would be okay. But now, as she went up Jane's driveway, she could see there were a few newspapers piled up at the end of it, which made her even more anxious that something was wrong here. And so Mary hurried right up the driveway, went to the front door, and began knocking. But as she and Karen stood there, they couldn't hear anything inside the house. Nobody was coming to the door. And so finally they left the porch and went around to the back of Jane's house to try her back door. And when the two women got into Jane's backyard, Mary froze because she could see the sliding glass door that led into Jane's living room was clearly wide open. And so Mary and Karen, from right there in the yard, just began yelling through the open door for Jane, but there was no answer. Eventually, Karen began to walk towards the open door like she was going to go inside, but Mary instinctively grabbed her and just said, "Don't." She was shaking and could barely think straight, but Mary felt like they just should not go in there, that it was not safe. And so instead, the two women ultimately backed away and went to go call the police. A few minutes later, Mary and Karen stood out on the street in front of Jane's house, watching as a police cruiser pulled up. The women immediately went over to the two deputies that got out, and they tried to explain the situation, that their friend was not responding to phone calls and that their back door was wide open, which just seemed really strange, and nobody knows what's going on. And so the officers asked Mary and Karen to take them to the back of the house where this open door was, and so they walked around the side yard, they went back there, and when they got there, Mary watched as one of the officers just walked up to the open door and stuck his head inside and began to look around. And as soon as he did that, Mary could see his body began to tense up, like he had seen something inside. Mary blurted out like, "Hey, what's going on? What's wrong?" But the officer, looking in the home, he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to his partner and told him to secure the scene and call for backup. There was someone inside, and he could already tell they were deceased. Hiring sounds simple until you have to do it. First, you're waiting for the right people to apply, and then you're sorting through resumes, trying to figure out who's actually qualified. And then after that, it's emails, it's scheduling, and a lot of back and forth. And before you know it, it's turned into a full-time job on top of your actual job? Well, the future of hiring looks much brighter because ZipRecruiter's latest tools and features help speed up finding the right people for your roles, so you save valuable time. And now you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ziprecruiter.com/ballin. Over 320,000 new resumes are added to ZipRecruiter monthly, so you can easily find and connect with qualified candidates in minutes and unlock their contact info instantly. Use ZipRecruiter and save time hiring. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. And if you go to ziprecruiter.com/ballin right now, you can try it for free. Again, that's ziprecruiter.com/ballin. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Just about an hour later, at around 6 p.m. on June 27, 2004, Detective Daniel Salcedo stopped his cruiser in front of a condo in Laguna Niguel, California. Dispatch hadn't told him much, just that an older woman had been found dead in her condo. When Salcedo got out of his car, he could see that there was police tape all over the condo's front door and the driveway. And just inside the perimeter, there was an officer speaking to 2 women who were crying and seemed very visibly upset. Dozens of other officers and crime scene technicians were also scattered around the area collecting evidence. And one deputy saw Salcedo and hurried over to give him an update. So the deceased woman had been identified as the owner of the condo, 72-year-old Jane Thompson. And at first glance, it very much appeared like she had been attacked. She had been murdered. Her 2 friends, the 2 women who were very upset talking to police, had called the police for a wellness check, and the officers who responded had found Jane lying in the living room. They'd been able to get through her sliding back door because the door was already open. Salcedo glanced back over at the 2 women in the driveway who were still talking to the police, and Salcedo told the deputy to make sure they stuck around because after he took a look inside, he wanted to speak to them as well. As the deputy hurried off to do what he was told, Salcedo walked around to the back of the house, and when he got there, he saw that not only was the sliding door open, but there really weren't any signs of forced entry around it, which could mean that it had been left unlocked, or that maybe Jane knew her attacker and let them in. And so Salcedo stepped inside the condo. And right away, he saw there were all these technicians all over the place working hard to gather evidence and process the scene. And also what he saw was blood spatter all over the walls and all over the furniture. And then when he looked down at the floor, he saw Jane's body. She was lying face down between her couch and coffee table with a large pool of blood around her head. Salcedo crouched down next to her to get a better look, and he saw her wounds were just brutal. Her head had been so badly pulverized that Salcedo could not only see her skull, the actual bone, but he could actually see the breaks in her skull. Her skull was shattered. Now, Salcedo would have to wait for the autopsy to be sure, but to Salcedo, it was very clear that somebody must have beaten this woman with some kind of heavy object over and over and over again. A couple of minutes later, Salcedo stood back up. Based on the extent of Jane's wounds, it seemed pretty obvious to him that this was a frenzied, rage-filled attack, and that it likely had happened really quickly, or maybe, the attack happened in such a way that Jane was completely caught off guard. Because aside from the awful trauma to Jane's head, Jane didn't appear to have really any other wounds. So it didn't seem like she tried to fight back or defend herself. And aside from the blood spatter, the room around her didn't show any signs of a struggle. It's like she just got destroyed right here and blood went everywhere. Salcedo left Jane's body and searched the rest of her condo. He went in her bedroom, searched her closets, went in the office, went in her kitchen, but there were no signs of anybody ransacking the condo. There was no obvious theft that had taken place, at least at first glance. There were expensive electronics that were still out and not claimed. So to Salcedo, at least right now, he was pretty sure this was not a robbery gone wrong. As he wrapped up his initial walkthrough of the condo, an officer called Salcedo back into the kitchen. And when Salcedo went over, he saw the officer was standing by the landline's answering machine. The officer told Salcedo there were a bunch of new messages on there, and they started the morning of Friday, June 25th. Now, Salcedo was very excited to hear that because that gave them something of a timeline to work off of. Because if Jane had stopped answering her phone by, Friday morning, then that means she could have died maybe overnight on that Thursday the 24th, or maybe even in the morning before that first message came through on the 25th. At least that would be the latest she could have died based on the message. So Salcedo told the officer to be sure to log the tape into evidence. Then Salcedo went back to the living room where Jane's body was and all the texts were, and he just stood there with his arms crossed, thinking about, what's he going to do next? Considering the attack had all the signs of being highly emotional, Salcedo felt confident that Jane's killer was someone who knew her and was deeply angry with her. So the first people he wanted to speak to were those that Jane was closest to, like family, friends, or maybe even romantic partners. Jane appeared to live alone, so he hoped other people in the neighborhood, or maybe those two women who called the police, could tell him more about Jane's personal life, her relationships, and give him a place to start. So Salcedo grabbed a few officers, and they headed outside to begin asking some questions. When he got outside, Salcedo could see there was now an audience of people, a crowd of, who Salcedo assumed were residents of this complex that were gathered at the edge of the police perimeter. And Salcedo understood why. Brutal homicides like this one rarely happened in this area, if ever. There was probably going to be a lot of panic and rumors in this community because of it. And based on the literal layout of this complex, the fact that all these condos are basically on top of each other, he knew that, those rumors would likely spread really quickly. But also, the fact these condos were tightly packed together gave Salcedo an advantage. Very likely because people are living on top of each other, somebody might have heard or seen something that could help break this case wide open. Just then, another police cruiser pulled up in front of the house, and a detective named Brian Sutton stepped out of the car. And when Salcedo saw who it was, he immediately felt relieved. Salcedo worked extremely well with Detective Sutton, and interviews were sort of like their specialty. As a duo, they had an instinct for asking the right questions that got people talking. So Salcedo hurried over to Sutton and quickly told him everything he'd learned so far. And once Sutton was up to speed, they went right over to the two women who had called 911. Salcedo was eager to interview them as witnesses, but he also was not ruling out the idea that they could also be suspects. He was sure this had to be a personal crime, and they clearly had some kind of relationship with Jane since they'd come over to check on her. When Salcedo reached the women, he could tell they had calmed down quite a bit from when he had first seen them when he first arrived. And the women, they were composed enough to tell him their names, Mary and Karen. They then explained that they were good friends with Jane and they'd come over to check on her. Because recently, Mary had gotten a call from Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese, who lived in LA. And Marion had been worried because Jane had not shown up in LA for plans they had. And so she was trying to find out where she was. Was she okay? And so Mary and Karen had gone to see if she was okay. This made Salcedo immediately perk up, and he asked Mary for Marion's information. As he jotted down Marion's phone number, Sutton asked the two women where they were on the night of the 24th or early morning of the 25th. So that was 2 nights ago and then also yesterday morning. And both of them said they had alibis. Now, the detectives would have to confirm their alibis because anybody can make up an alibi. But for right now, Salcedo was comfortable ruling Mary and Karen out as suspects. They both seemed genuinely stunned by Jane's murder. And while it did seem like they were good friends with Jane, he wasn't sure they had the kind of intense closeness that might have led to such a vicious attack. So he told the two women they could go home. And then Salcedo nodded to Sutton, and the two of them left the women and headed towards the crowd of neighbors to ask some more questions. The next morning, Monday, June 28th, and Salcedo was behind the wheel of his cruiser with Sutton in the passenger seat. They were almost at the end of their long drive up to Los Angeles to interview Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese. Salcedo was eager to get her statement, because right now, they didn't have that many other leads. The forensics team hadn't found any DNA or fingerprints at the scene to test against future suspects. And the canvas of Jane's condo complex the night before really hadn't yielded much either. They'd learned that no one had seen Jane since Thursday, which backed up the timeline they'd already gotten from the answering machine. But none of the neighbors heard or saw anything strange on that Thursday night. And according to her neighbors, Jane did not have any obvious tension with anybody in the community. She generally kept to herself, but was really well liked by everyone who met her. But Salcedo, again, from what he had just seen at the crime scene, felt sure that someone out there had to have had a problem with Jane. He'd seen the autopsy that morning, and it confirmed that Jane, unsurprisingly, had died from the wounds to her head. But it also told him something else. She'd been hit more than a dozen times. It was complete overkill. And to Salcedo, it meant the killer had to have been driven by some kind of intense emotion, like rage or maybe greed, which was why they were now making this drive out to LA to speak with Marion, who Salcedo felt, based on her relationship to Jane, she was the strongest suspect they had, because romance can make you do crazy things. Also, Salcedo had done some digging into Jane's finances the night before, and he found out she had a life insurance policy worth $100,000. And Marion Reese was the sole beneficiary, which meant Marion definitely had something to gain financially, at least, from Jane's death. So as they pulled up to Marion's house, Salcedo was thinking, maybe we found our killer. A few minutes later, the detective sat on a couch in Marion Reese's living room. The home was on the small side, even by LA standards, but it was very tastefully decorated. Marion sat down across from them in an armchair, and when they looked at her, they could see her eyes were very red and puffy, like she'd been crying. She also had a glass of water in her hand that she kept lifting up, like she was gonna take a sip, but then she would just place it back down again without taking a sip. It was like she didn't know what she was doing. Marion had clearly already heard about Jane's death, and to Salcedo, she really was showing every sign of genuinely being in shock. So he wanted to be very careful with his line of questions and make sure, he didn't overwhelm her. If she just shut down, he might not get the information that he really needed. So, after a minute, Salcedo began by just asking Marion how she knew Jane. And Marion, she took a deep breath, and then with a very shaky voice, she explained that they'd known each other for almost 50 years. They used to work together. Jane had done a lot of producing for Marion's production company. As Marion went on to describe more about how they met each other and how it kind of transitioned from working together to, romance, Salcedo could sense that Marion was kind of calming down. And she was calming down to the point where he felt like now he could introduce the tough stuff. So he turned and he nodded to Sutton. And at that point, Sutton asked Marion if she knew that Jane had named her, Marion, as the sole beneficiary on her life insurance policy. And Marion immediately gasped, and she said she had no idea Jane had done that. But she also said it did sort of make sense. She said that Jane really didn't have any family, and in some ways, Marion was her family, or at least was her closest relationship. Now, Salcedo felt like Marion's reaction to this was very earnest, but he couldn't be sure. So he pressed her some more, and he asked her where she was last Thursday night when presumably, Jane was killed. But Marion just said she was with friends all night in LA, and she gave Salcedo all the phone numbers of these friends so he and his partner could confirm it. They talked for a while longer as Marion went over the details of how Jane missed their opera date on Friday and then stopped returning her calls, and it all lined up with what Jane's friend, Mary, had told them. So eventually, Salcedo and Sutton stood up to leave. Over an hour later, Detective Salcedo and Sutton were back in Laguna Niguel, California, and they parked their cruiser in front of Jane's condo. On their drive back from Marion's house in LA, the detectives had called some of Marion's friends to confirm her alibi. And they all confirmed that on the night Jane was killed, they were with her and she was in LA. And so now Salcedo had to admit that Marion was looking less and less like a suspect. So now the detectives were back at Jane's condo to look into another working theory about what might have happened here. Maybe Jane's murder was a hate crime. So remember, this was back in 2004 when being a homosexual was just not as widely accepted as it is today. And so their theory was, maybe one of Jane's neighbors had seen Marion, Jane's girlfriend, visiting, or maybe heard about their relationship and they didn't like it, and so they lashed out. And then also strengthening the idea that, one of the neighbors could have done this was the fact that it was sort of common knowledge in this neighborhood that most people left their doors unlocked. And so it sort of strengthened the idea that maybe a neighbor did this, maybe because of their hate towards Jane and her way of life. However, Sutton and Salcedo knew that actually investigating this theory was going to be extremely challenging. There were 144 houses in the complex, and so conducting a thorough investigation of every resident of all those houses was just going to take a lot of time. But they didn't have any other options, so the detectives got to work, and they went to the first house next to Jane's and knocked. A few hours later, Salcedo and Sutton returned to the Orange County Sheriff's Department. They had spent most of the afternoon talking to people who lived in Jane's condo complex, and while they hadn't talked to everyone, they already had to admit that their hate crime theory was looking sort of like a wash. Most people didn't even know Jane was in a relationship at all, since her girlfriend, Marion, lived in a different city, so they didn't see her. And also, there was just nothing anybody in the neighborhood said that made the detectives think that Jane was being targeted really for any reason. But a few people had mentioned that recently there had been some burglaries in the complex, which was completely unheard of in a place like Laguna Niguel. Still, there was a huge difference between somebody breaking in and stealing some stuff and breaking in and bludgeoning someone to death. But it was a lead. And that's what Salcedo was thinking about as he and Sutton walked towards their desks. But before they got there, Salcedo had this epiphany. And he just stopped in his tracks and he turned to Sutton and said, "Turn around. We have to go back to the evidence room. I think everything we need to solve this case might be in the building with them right now." The following day, Salcedo and Sutton pulled up in front of a restaurant called the Beach House. The previous afternoon, Salcedo had suggested that he and Sutton go back to the evidence room and listen to Jane's answering machine tapes. Now, to be clear, they had already listened to the tapes before, but none of the messages had seemed particularly important. But now, based on what they'd learned over the course of their investigation, they realized that those messages actually told them a lot. And so Salcedo and Sutton had spent hours re-listening to the tapes and gathering even more evidence to confirm what was on it. And even though they were pretty sure all this evidence they were getting told them who killed Jane, they still needed one more piece to fall into place. Now they had a book of photos with them, and they knew for a fact that one of these photographs was of their killer, and they just needed somebody in this restaurant to verify it. So as soon as they got inside, they found the manager and explained why they were there, and then they asked him, "Hey, would you mind looking at these photos to see if you recognize anyone?" The manager looked a bit alarmed, but he ultimately agreed and said he would. So they went into the back room, they opened up their book of photos, and the manager looked, and pretty much immediately he pointed to one picture. And when Salcedo saw the person the manager was pointing to, he knew they'd cracked the case. Based on forensic evidence and also a confession, here is what investigators believe happened to Jane Thompson in the early morning hours of June 25th, 2004. The killer, clad in dark clothes and gloves, and also holding a hammer, stood in the darkness right outside of Jane's back sliding glass doors. Now, the killer had already been to Jane's house a few times that night, but each time they had come earlier, they had ultimately chickened out and left, because when they would get there, they would look in the back door and they would see Jane asleep on the couch in front of the TV. But that was a problem. They needed Jane to leave the room and go to her bedroom to go sleep in there. But she wasn't doing that. But this time, as they stood outside the glass doors, they knew they had to go in there, or they would never get what they wanted from Jane, even if she was right there on the couch. So the killer took a deep breath and then reached forward and tried to open the back door. And it slid right open, just as they expected. It was unlocked. Once it was open, the killer very carefully, very quietly, stepped inside and made their way over to the couch where Jane was. They wanted to check to make sure Jane was still asleep. But as the killer is hovering over Jane, looking down at her, she's on her back on the couch, the killer practically fainted when Jane opened her eyes and looked right at them. And the killer was so surprised and so scared that they instinctively lifted up their hammer and brought it down on Jane's head. And when the killer finally stopped and kind of calmed down for a second, they just stared at Jane's destroyed body in total shock. Then they backed away and realized the hammer, the murder weapon, was dripping blood everywhere. So they grabbed the head of the hammer with their gloved hand to kind of stop it from dripping, and then ran right back out the sliding door. The killer hurried across the street outside, tossing the hammer into the trash as they went. And when they finally got to their home, they stripped off their clothes, balled them up, and then tried to decide where to hide them. And as they thought about that, they looked out their bedroom window at the house across the street, where they'd just killed the one person who had given them a second chance. It would turn out Jane was murdered by a child. her 15-year-old neighbor, Sam Nelson. Sam had actually broken into Jane's house more than once. He'd broken in repeatedly and stolen a lot of things from her, including her credit cards. That was what the phone messages had been about. Jane's credit card company had called her back after she had reported a series of fraudulent charges. And one of those charges was at that restaurant that the investigators visited with the photo lineup. And the manager, when he looked at the photos, recognized Sam, because Sam had been in there recently. The reason Sam was stealing from Jane, and also from other people in the neighborhood, was ultimately just because he was trying to keep up with his appearance. He used these stolen credit cards and money to buy food and items that would, in his mind, impress his wealthy classmates. On the night of Jane's murder, Sam did not go in there with the intention of killing her. He went in there with the intention of robbing her. But for whatever reason, when, she opened her eyes and saw him, he sort of panicked, hit her once with a hammer, the blood went in his mouth, his mind went blank, and then suddenly he's beating her to death. Sam was arrested and eventually sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for Jane's murder and also for multiple counts of burglary. His earliest eligible release date is in 2027. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you the photo that is famously associated with them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please dress the like button in a realistic bear suit, and then send them to the next Omante ritual in Japan. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 2016, 21-year-old Darren Mitchell was living in southeast Texas in a town called Navasota. He was serving in the U.S. National Guard, he was the proud father of a 1-year-old little girl, and he was engaged to the little girl's mother. Anyone that knew Darren knew his main goal in life was to support his little beloved family. While he personally really wanted to go to a trade school, he ended up putting his dream on hold to raise money so his fiancée could go to nursing school. And their plan was, after she completed nursing school, Darren would then raise more money and go to school himself. That spring, southeast Texas was hit with record rainfalls. It seemed like for Darren, every time he went to and from work, the sky was always gray and the road was always wet. But of all the thunderstorms that passed through that area that year, there was none more powerful than the 24-hour thunderstorm that began on May 26th. That afternoon, Darren was on his way home from work. He was traveling along Texas State Highway 105. It was raining so hard that his windshield wipers literally could not keep up with the amount of water hitting his windshield. And so he eventually just had to slow way down just to make sure he didn't crash into anyone. He looked around him and the fields and the ditches next to the road were already filling with water because the ground was already completely saturated from all the rainfall over the past couple of months. Before long, Darren found himself stopping right in the middle of the highway behind this huge row of traffic. Apparently there was some significant flooding up ahead on the road and people were hesitant to drive through it. And so after a while, when this huge row of traffic was just not moving and the rain was just continuing to pour down, Darren started to worry he might be in an emergency situation, that this could be a flash flood scenario. And so he called his brother and he told him that he was stuck on Highway 105 because there was flooding up ahead, there was flooding behind him, he couldn't really go anywhere. And so his brother asked him, what are you going to do? And at some point Darren said, hey, I can actually get out my window, so I'm fine, I'll talk to you later. But after that, nobody heard from Darren. And later that afternoon, when Darren didn't make it home, his family got really concerned and they called the police. And so that night, a search was launched to find Darren, but there was no sign of him. But the next morning, they did discover Darren's blue pickup truck. It had flipped over. It was off the side of the highway near a river that had been created by the floodwaters. Darren was not inside of the vehicle, but 24 hours later, they did discover his body. He had drowned and he had drifted 1 mile downstream of his truck. The family was obviously devastated by this horrible loss, but they just could not reconcile how he had been on the phone with his brother saying that he was going to be just fine to just a couple days later being found dead. And it would turn out there was actually a witness that watched what happened to Darren. She had been caught up in this flash flood as well, except she was in a vehicle that did not get swept away. And so she was watching Darren as the floodwaters raged around his vehicle, and she said he climbed out of the window and he got into the bed of his pickup truck, and then from the bed he moved up to the roof of his truck, and at this point the waters began pulling his vehicle, and so his vehicle became unsteady, and from her perspective it seemed like Darren did not like his odds on the roof of his truck, and so he climbed back inside of his truck. And then just a couple of minutes later, his vehicle was dragged into a deeper section of the water, and it flipped upside down and was pulled under, and Darren did not reemerge. With this information, Darren's family was able to figure out that when Darren climbed back into his truck right before it flipped over, he posted something to Facebook that now, looking back at it, is unbelievably haunting. Randy Weaver was a college dropout and a former Army Green Beret, which is the Army's Special Forces. He and his wife Vicky were religious fundamentalists and deeply distrusted the government and believed the end of the world was imminent. In the early 1980s, they began hoarding guns and began making plans to live in some secluded area off the grid. In 1984, Randy, Vicky, and their children moved into a cabin they had built themselves overlooking Ruby Creek in Idaho. By choice, they had no electricity and no water. After receiving information that Randy had made threats against the President Ronald Reagan and other government officials, the FBI and the Secret Service began investigating him. Although no charges were ever filed against him, in their investigation, they discovered he had ties to the Aryan Nation, which is a white supremacist group. So in 1989, when Randy inadvertently sold 2 illegal weapons to undercover ATF agents, they said, instead of arresting you and sending you to jail, you can actually become an informant on the Aryan Nation. But Randy said he wasn't tied to the Aryan Nation and couldn't do that, and so they indicted him for making and keeping illegal weapons. After being released on bail in 1991, Randy missed his court date, and so a warrant was issued for his arrest. The U.S. Marshal Service was now responsible for bringing Randy in, but given his significant weapon arsenal and his anti-government stance, they assumed he would not go easily, and so they decided they would launch a secret surveillance campaign of Randy, his family, and where they lived to gain some intelligence on what they did day to day and find the right time to go up and apprehend him. So in early 1992, secret surveillance teams were set up all around the Weaver family cabin, and what they found was the Weaver family, despite being extremist, they mostly kept to themselves, and they definitely were not aware they were being watched. The only reason the marshals didn't just go up and apprehend him was because anytime the Weavers were outside of their cabin, they were always armed. A few months later, in August, as the surveillance teams were getting ready to set up for the day to gather more intelligence on the Weavers, the Weaver dogs took notice of the surveillance teams and started charging into the woods barking like maniacs. And Randy, along with his friend Kevin Harris that was staying with them, and Randy's teenage son Sammy, took off after the dogs, not knowing that they were going to be running straight into a government surveillance team. And when these two parties encountered each other, a firefight ensued that left Sammy, Randy's son, dead, along with their dog dead, and one of the marshals, William Deegan, was killed as well. Who shot first and who shot whom would later be hotly debated by all the survivors in the courts and in the media. Immediately after the shooting stopped, Randy and Kevin turned around and ran back up to the cabin to take cover. Meanwhile, the surviving marshals ran out of the forest and they told their boss what had happened, and their boss is like, this is going to turn into a standoff, we need this to end right now. And so he called the FBI and he painted a picture of the Weaver family and Randy specifically as this enormous threat, that it had been this unprovoked attack on the marshals and that they got to come in force to put an end to this thing. And so the next day, hundreds of FBI agents, huge vehicles and helicopters, they all showed up in this little area in Idaho getting ready to do battle with the Weaver family. Because the FBI had been told the Weaver family was this huge threat, they authorized all of their snipers to shoot any armed adult without warning them. Normally, the FBI, if they see someone who's armed, they would yell at them to stop what they were doing, put their weapon down, warn them. Unless, of course, this person is actively shooting at them, then of course the FBI is going to shoot back. But if it's just an armed person standing there,
The FBI can't just engage them. But in this situation, the FBI said, this threat is so big, we're changing the rules. And so you had all these FBI snipers all around the Weaver property that are all amped up. They're getting ready to engage the enemy. They're off safe, finger on trigger, slack out, ready to engage the first adult they see. And so it stayed like this for quite a while, a total stalemate, until Randy, Kevin Harris, and Randy's teenage daughter Sarah decided to leave their cabin and go down to Sammy to pay their respects. But Randy and Kevin were carrying weapons, and so after they left the cabin, they walked a little ways away, and then snipers opened up on them. In that initial volley of fire, only Randy got hit in the shoulder, and so Randy, Kevin, and Sarah, they turn, they start running back towards the cabin to take cover, and standing in the doorway of the cabin, inside the cabin, is Vicky, Randy's wife, and she's standing there holding their 10-month-old daughter, and so Randy makes it inside, Sarah makes it in the front door, Kevin is the last one to go through the door, and right as he's going through the doorway, the sniper had his sights set on Kevin, and he fired, he missed Kevin, the round went through the door, and it hit Vicky squarely in the head, and it killed her instantly. Adding insult to injury, the FBI did not know they had just killed their mother, and so after the shooting stopped and the door had shut and the Weavers are back inside the cabin, the FBI began calling out to them saying, Mrs. Weaver, come out, don't you want to protect your kids? Come out and we'll get you guys pancakes and you can sit with your kids. You got to get them out of there. But Vicky was dead, they just didn't know. Ultimately, the FBI went out and got a highly decorated Vietnam War veteran who had similar views to Randy, and they sent him in to try to convince Randy to stop this and surrender, and eventually he got Randy to do that, so no more blood was shed. Later, an investigation would show law enforcement that was handling this case made a number of really critical mistakes early on. The first big mistake being the miscommunication between the marshals to the FBI about how big of a threat the Weaver family really posed. Now, they certainly were a threat, but they were not such a big threat that they required hundreds of FBI agents and helicopters and armored vehicles. The second critical mistake was when the FBI authorized their snipers to shoot at armed adults without a warning. That's almost certainly why Vicky was killed. In the end, despite having a plethora of charges against him, jurors decided that Randy Weaver was only guilty of not showing up to that court date. Amid intense federal scrutiny of the Ruby Ridge scandal, the FBI's number 2 person was demoted, 3 other agents were suspended, and 1 was sent to jail for trying to cover up the mistakes the FBI had made during this case. As for the Weaver family, they were given a $3.1 million settlement by the government, and Kevin Harris had all charges dropped against him, and he won a 6-figure settlement. Of all the pictures that came out of Ruby Ridge, there's none more famous than this one taken by one of the surveillance teams of Vicky just before she was shot by that sniper. Scattered across the North American continent are many ghost towns, places that used to be vibrant and alive that are now dead and abandoned. In these places, you can find old churches and buildings and schools that are usually in a pretty significant state of decay. The reasons a town might die varies. Sometimes it's because a new railroad or highway is put in that bypasses the town, or the town has just exhausted all of their natural resources, which were the original draw to the town. Mining towns are a good example of that. Other reasons are wars, natural disasters, political wranglings. There's a whole bunch of reasons why towns just suddenly stop existing. But there's one ghost town in North America that has a really unique and very dark reason for why it ultimately was abandoned, and that town is Portlock, Alaska. Portlock, which is also called Port Chatham, is located on the farthest southwestern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. It's easily one of the most beautiful areas in all of Alaska, but it also happens to be very remote. And Portlock specifically, even by Kenai standards, is considered extremely remote. You can only get there by boat or by bush plane. The town was technically founded in 1787 when Captain Nathaniel Portlock of the Royal Navy landed there, but it wasn't really turned into a real settlement until the early 1900s when commercial fishermen built a cannery there. By 1921, the town's fishing economy was doing so well that the US government believed they would be the next major commercial fishing hub, and so they actually established a post office there. Everything seemed to be going great for Portlock until the 1930s when rumors began seeping out along the Kenai Peninsula that there was something wrong with Portlock. Men from this cannery town were going missing at an alarming rate, and the few that were found again were always found dead and mutilated in a nearby lagoon. Initially, the townspeople believed these were bear attacks, but the natives of the Kenai Peninsula that found out about what was happening in Portlock, they stopped by and they said, those are not bear attacks. Those are almost certainly attacks by a creature we call the Nantina, which means half man, half beast. And they are tall, two-legged, hairy creatures that live in the forest right near you. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore. But when you consider the fact that from 1930 to 1950, dozens of Portlock residents disappeared in that forest or were violently killed and then dumped in the lagoon right outside of the forest, it makes you wonder what's in the forest. But since none of the people who went missing were ever found alive again, there was never any good description of what it was that was causing them to disappear in the first place. Well, with the exception of one case. In 1943, John Meyer, who was a resident of Portlock, was at his campsite and he was crouched down when he felt something leap onto his back and start pummeling his head and hitting him on the side, and he kind of went into the fetal position, and then at some point his dog started barking and caused whatever was on his back to get scared and run off. And so John, who's been badly beaten, rolls over and he looks towards the tree line and he sees this enormous, tall, hairy man running into the woods. And so John gets up and he stumbles his way into town to try to get help, and he's able to tell someone what happened to him before he ultimately succumbs to his injuries and dies. After the John Meyer incident, another group of Portlock men were up in the forest doing some hunting when they discovered these enormous 18-inch long tracks, and they followed them to a clearing where it looked like there was this epic death struggle, that clearly two huge animals had gotten into a struggle here. There's blood everywhere, there's pieces of what looked like a bear or maybe a moose, and then these tracks continued out of this clearing and went right up the mountain, and the men did not dare follow those tracks to see whatever it was that emerged victorious in this clearing. Even the Alaskan newspapers began speculating that something was off about Portlock. This was more than just some crime being committed, that there's something happening there that we can't understand. And so by 1949, when people were still going missing mysteriously in the forest, and then other people were turning up dead and mutilated in the lagoon, the townspeople said, enough. This is an unsafe place to live. We don't know what's causing this, but we have to leave. And then practically overnight, the town evacuated, leaving behind most of their possessions. The only person that stayed a little bit longer was the postmaster, because he had to wait for the post office to be shut down. And he said it was horrifying that he would see things walking in the trees, and he would hear these horrible sounds, and so he was eager to get out of there. And so in early 1950, he was allowed to go, and then that was it. The population of Portlock went down to zero. After they left, none of the people from Portlock or any of their family members ever went back to Portlock. So the only people that have really ever gone back to Portlock are people that unfortunately wound up there, like in the 1970s when some fishermen got caught in a storm, and so they sought refuge in Portlock. But after setting up their camp, they saw something huge walk past them in the tree line, and it apparently was so terrifying that they literally packed up their camp, went back in their boat, and then went back out into the storm to avoid whatever it was they saw. Besides the fishermen, the only people that have gone to Portlock are people that want to come face to face with whatever it is that drove the people out of that town. But to put in perspective how few people do that, there's almost no modern photographs or videos of Portlock. But there is one very eerie modern photograph of this building that's right in the heart of Portlock. It's one of the very few buildings that didn't collapse, and it's located right next to the forest where many of the men who went missing were last seen. And it's also not far from the lagoon where many of the dead men and dead people that were taken were found. And even if you don't believe there's some Nantina running around the forests of Portlock, you have to understand that something was killing and taking these people in the forest that you are looking at right now. And to date, we still have no idea what it was. Which means this is one of the creepiest pictures you will find on the internet. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please dress the like button in a realistic bear suit and then send them to the next Omante ritual in Japan. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's video is brought to you by Current.
Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 1 or 2 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button has an itch on their back, offer to scratch it for them, but then continuously misunderstand their directions so you never actually itch the right spot. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On January 1st, 2015, a family in South Yorkshire, England, gathered at a restaurant for their annual New Year's Day lunch. But one member of this family who said they would be attending didn't show up. It was 50-year-old Stephen Winfrey, who was an unemployed, divorced father of 2, who in recent years had become quite depressed. When they reached out to him on his phone and he didn't pick up, the family pretty quickly started to worry that something could have happened to him, that, perhaps he did something to harm himself given his mental state. But his sister, Nadine, who was at this lunch, she reassured the rest of the family that she had spoken to Stephen the night before and he was in great spirits and had told her that his plan was to go rabbit hunting the next day on New Year's Day before heading over to the restaurant for lunch. And because Nadine knew that her brother recently had really taken a liking to rabbit hunting, it was one of the very few things that actually made him happy, she told the family, look, I bet you anything he just lost track of time and he will get here late, or maybe we won't see him at all, but at least he's out doing something that makes him happy. And so the family was reassured by this, and so they sat down at their table, they ordered their food, and the whole meal, everyone's kind of looking over at the front door, expecting Stephen to come strolling in at any minute. But when they finished up eating, he still had not arrived. And so as the family was getting ready to leave the restaurant and head back home, they all decided that, you know what, I'm sure Stephen is fine, he's doing something he loves, I'm sure he did just get carried away, and so we'll just wait for him to contact us. And so the family, they all leave the restaurant and they spend the rest of the day at their respective households, and then the following morning they all get in touch with each other and they discover that still no one has seen or heard from Stephen. And so at this point the family just felt like there was something off about this, and so they contacted the police and they reported him missing. As the police were getting ready to head out and begin looking for Stephen that day, they received a call. Stephen had been found. Although the exact details of what happened to Stephen may never be fully understood, this is the best theory that the police have come up with. On New Year's Day, January 1st, the day Stephen was supposed to meet his family for lunch, he had gotten up early and headed out to a nearby forested park to do some rabbit hunting, just like he told his sister he would be. He had gone to the park with his dog and some ferrets. The way Stephen caught rabbits is he would release these ferrets into various rabbit holes, and then he would stand back with his rifle and he would wait for the ferret to run the rabbits out of their holes, out into the open, and then he would raise his rifle and shoot at the rabbits, and then his dog would run over and grab the rabbit and bring it back to him. And so all morning long, he was doing this with relative success, and then something happened to where Stephen decided he needed to actually look inside of one of these rabbit holes. Perhaps one of his ferrets got stuck, or one of the rabbits got stuck, but either way, he wanted to look into the opening of one of these rabbit holes, and so he walked over to it, and apparently he couldn't quite see whatever it was he wanted to see, and so he got down on his hands and knees and stuck his head into this rabbit hole opening. Now, these openings to these rabbit holes are pretty narrow, and so once he forced his head inside, it got stuck. He could not pull it out again. And so all around the outside of this hole where his head was stuck, there were these deep divots that his hands had obviously dug once he realized he was stuck, because he was trying to dig the entrance a little bit wider to get his head out. But as he was working really, really hard and laboring to kind of dig this hole out, he was burning up the very limited amount of oxygen that was inside of this hole. And so very quickly, as he was trying to save himself, he would have started to struggle breathing because there just wasn't enough air in this hole. And so when it became clear he was starting to suffocate, he abandoned the approach of trying to dig himself out and began trying to contort his body outside of the hole at really extreme angles to try to pop his head out
even if it meant breaking his neck in the process. But no matter how hard he tried, he just could not get his head out. The following day, January 2nd at 4 p.m., this is after Stephen has been reported missing, a person walking through that forested park, they found Stephen. They saw his body poking out of that hole at a really extreme angle, and so they called the police. The police showed up to the park, and they confirmed that Stephen was dead. He had suffocated. His death was not ruled a suicide. It was determined to be an accident. As for Stephen's dog and his ferrets, they were found near his body, and they were unhurt. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Current. Nowadays, virtually everything we do in our lives is done either exclusively online or there is an option to do it online. And I think we can all agree that that represents progress. I know that I opt for the online option virtually every single time. But there is one area of our lives that seems slow to evolve, and that is banking. It's shocking to me that in 2021, many banks still require us to actually go into their physical location to handle certain aspects of our account. And I don't know about you, but I don't like the idea of sitting in front of a bank rep and making major financial decisions while someone is literally waiting for me. That's so stressful. After signing up with Current, which is a mobile banking app, they send you your very own custom debit card. Here's mine. And then after that, everything is done online. They have a great rewards program. They have a great savings program called Savings Pods. No more pressure, no more inconvenience, just money management done exclusively online the way it should be. Also, Current and I are going to be giving away $10,000 to you all. The way it works is you go download Current using the code MrBallen, and then you could be one of 20 people that receives $500 from this promotion. Okay, back to the stories. Brian Joplin was born in 1972 and was raised in this tiny town in Oklahoma called Hugo. He was a big guy, so growing up, he was always encouraged to play football, and he did, but his real passion had always been working on cars. It was something he loved to do, and he was extremely good at doing. After he graduated high school, he stuck around in Hugo doing some auto body work, but he got this feeling that he should do something bigger with his life. And so in 1992, he decided to enlist in the United States Navy. This was something his family was extremely proud of him for doing, especially his grandfather, who had flown bomber planes during World War II. Following Brian's initial military training, better known as boot camp, he was sent to Aviation Machinist Mate School, which is a military school for military members that teaches you how to be a mechanic for all things that fly. And so after Brian breezed through the school, because he was already a very skilled mechanic, and so it came to him naturally, he was sent to his first duty station out in California. And so he joins his California unit, and immediately he excels, and he becomes one of the very best mechanics at his unit, despite being one of the most junior. And while he was in California, he also met his wife, Belinda. And so over the next several years that he was in California, and then he moved around to Texas and a couple other places, he just continued to shine at work. And at home, he and his wife began building a family. They had 2 daughters. And so by and large, everything in Brian's life was going exactly to plan, until Brian made a terrible mistake. Fast forward to October 4th, 2005, and Brian, who was 32 at the time, was deployed with his unit to Bahrain, which is a country in the Persian Gulf. That particular day, Brian, along with 2 other mechanics from his unit and 2 pilots from his unit, had been tasked with flying from Bahrain north to Kuwait, which is another country in the Persian Gulf. This was a routine flight, about an hour long. It was one they had made several times during this deployment. Brian was not really looking forward to doing it, and neither were the other people that were on this particular flight. But Brian decided the way he would make this trip less monotonous and boring is he would perform the stunt. So Brian and the other 2 mechanics, they load in the back of this helicopter in the cargo area, so the passenger area of this helo, and the 2 pilots, they load into the cockpit. And within a couple of minutes, they were 125 feet off the ground, careening forward out over the Persian Gulf at over 120 miles an hour. Brian and the other 2 mechanics in the back of this craft had elected to keep the back loading ramp that folds up and down to allow people to come in and out of this helicopter. They had decided to keep it down
down for this flight. So basically, they had this huge opening that just looked straight down to the earth. But this is a very common thing in the military. Lots of helicopters, when they're flying around, have either a side door open or the back ramp down because it provides an incredible view. And more importantly, it provides this amazing breeze inside of the cabin. A few minutes later, when the helicopter is way out over the Persian Gulf, Brian decides now is a good time to do this stunt. And so he looks across at the other side of the helicopter and kind of signals at the other two mechanics. It's super loud inside of the back of a helo, and so there's no way they could have spoken to each other besides with a headset, and they were not about to speak about this stunt over the headset because they didn't want the pilots to know. And so Brian signaled to the other two because they were totally in on his stunt he was about to do. And so they grinned, and one of them pulled out a camera to be ready for what he was going to do. And then Brian disconnected his helo lanyard. So inside of a military helicopter, you'll find all these metal eyelets, these little rings all over the floor, the walls, the ceiling. And these are there in order to attach cargo or strap things down, or to attach yourself, a person, inside of the helicopter. And so the way you do that is by using your helo lanyard. It's this belt you wear that has this special strap that comes off the front of it. And at the end of this 1 or 2 foot long strap is a carabiner, a clip. And you clip that onto any of those eyelets. And so that keeps you from flying out of the helicopter. If the pilots need to maneuver suddenly, or if you lose altitude, anything can happen inside. And so Brian removes his helo lanyard and then grabs this stretch of nylon rope. It was like a crudely built safety harness that kind of functioned like a helo lanyard in the sense that there was a carabiner on one end, and on the other there was a way to attach it to yourself. But unlike it being this belt and kind of high-tech system that attached to him, it was really just kind of a slip knot on one end of this 10-foot long line. And so Brian most likely had built this 10-foot long safety harness for this particular stunt, or someone else had. But either way, he picks this up after detaching his helo lanyard, and he puts the loop end of this 10-foot line, the slip knot end, over his head down to his waist, and then cinched it tight. And then he very carefully stood up and walked towards the back of the helo, and then he clipped the end of this 10-foot line with the carabiner into one of the eyelets on the ground, right where the back ramp begins to go down. And so once that was in place, he turned and looked at the other two mechanics and gave them one more thumbs up, and then he got down on his hands and knees and he begins crawling backwards down the ramp. And so once he gets to the very edge of this ramp, so literally right behind him is just the open air. At that point, he grabs with his left hand one of those metal rings that are on the actual ramp itself. He gets a firm grip with one hand, and then with his right hand, he grabs the side of the ramp. There's some metal framing there. And so once he had a good grip and he felt confident in it, he kind of slowly lowered his lower half until it slipped off of the ramp. And as soon as it did, the winds outside the helicopter, the 120-mile-an-hour plus winds, they immediately swept his legs up and kind of held them in the air horizontal like he was flying. And so he's holding on to the back of the ramp, but his arms are kind of tucked up near his chest. But once he feels his legs up in the air, he slowly extends himself. And finally, when they were fully extended, he was officially doing the Superman stunt. This was called Supermaning, what he was doing. And as soon as he was in this position, the other crew members inside of the helicopter, they knew this was it. Let's take some pictures. And so one of them got their camera out and took some pictures of him. And Brian knows he's getting pictures taken. He's holding on as tight as he can. And then after the pictures were taken and Brian looked up and kind of got the thumbs up that he was good, he began trying to pull himself back into the helicopter, but he lost his grip. And as soon as he lost his grip, those 120-mile-an-hour plus winds, they whipped him backwards, and the safety harness that he had strapped around his waist, that's the only thing that caught him from flying away from the helicopter. And so Brian attempts to try to grab the ramp, but it's too far away, and as he's getting pulled by the wind away from the helicopter, that harness that was around his waist, it rides up until it stops right around his chest. And so at that point, he keeps his arms pinned by his side because he doesn't want the harness to slip up over his shoulders, because then he will fall to his death. But because this harness was self-tightening, as he was whipping in the winds, the wind was pulling him so hard away from the helicopter that it was tightening that loop around his chest. And so his chest got so tightly squeezed that it caused him to pass out. And as soon as that happened, his arms that were holding that harness in place, well, his arms went limp, and then the wind whipped his arms over his head, and the the harness immediately slipped up over his shoulders, off his head, off his arms, and he went flying 125 feet all the way down to the water below where he died. There were at least 8 people that were punished for this incident, including the 2 crew members in the back of the helicopter taking pictures because they were totally in on this, but the details of the punishments were never made public. In the late 1860s, a group of rugged American explorers came out of the wilderness and went straight to a newspaper to tell them about this otherworldly place they had found. And so the newspaper sat down, they got their notepad out, and these explorers start describing this place. And they say, okay, well, it's this huge expanse of wilderness. And in the middle of it, there are all these boiling lakes that are either neon green or yellow or red or all of those. And they're shooting boiling water into the sky. And there are these breathtaking waterfalls and snow-capped mountains, and there are bison and elk and wolves and bears just free roaming the whole area. And so the newspaper, they take all this down, and at the end of it, they say, okay, guys, well, unfortunately, we don't publish fiction. But these explorers weren't lying. They were describing an area that we now know as Yellowstone National Park, which is this massive expanse of wilderness in Wyoming that sits on top of a volcano. And those boiling neon green, red, and yellow lakes really do exist. Those are hot springs, and they are the result of water passing by and making contact with underground magma chambers. Today, Yellowstone is so popular that every year millions of people go to the park, and so as a result, the park employs hundreds of people year-round to keep up with tourism. Many of these employees are young people, like college students, and in addition to being paid for their work, the park also offers them the ability to live in employee housing, which are basically dormitories spaced all across the park to make it easier to just be on site and do their job. And these dormitories are either free or very low cost. And so these young people typically take up that offer and will stay inside of these dormitories for as long as they're working at the park. And so in 2000, a 20-year-old summer employee named Sarah Hulfers, she was staying in one of these dormitories in the park, and she was in her room when a group of other young employees that were staying in this dorm came down the hall, and they knocked on her door, and they asked her if she wanted to come with them to go swimming. And so Sarah, she had a day off and she wasn't doing anything. And so she said, sure, I'll come with you guys. And so after they all got their bathing suits on and got their towels and snacks packed, they left the dormitories and got into a couple of cars. And then they drove over to this dirt lot that was right up against this huge forest. And so they parked, they got out, and they make their way over to this trailhead that begins in the parking lot and goes straight into this forest. And so they walk down this trail until the trail goes right out of the forest and brings them to the edge of this river. And this river was called the Firehole River. It was called that because the surface of this river steamed, and it gave the impression that this river was on fire. The reason this happened is some of the water flowing through this river would pass by those underground magma chambers, warming it up. And so this is a lot like the hot springs, except on a much smaller level. The hot springs are boiling, whereas this river was just slightly warmer to the point where it would steam. So totally safe to swim in. So Sarah and the rest of this group, they come out of that trailhead and they're standing on the edge of this beautiful river, and they walk down to the edge and they all jump in and they have this great day. They're swimming around, they're playing games, and they were only expecting to be there for a couple of hours, but they were having so much fun that before long, the sun had gone down and they were still in the river. And so when it was dark out, they finally climbed out of the river and they toweled off, and then they realized they had a bit of a problem. Because they did not expect to be there for as long as they were, no one had brought flashlights, and the way back to the parking lot would be going along that trail through the forest, but that was a pretty far trail, and it's totally pitch black out. There's no ambient light. And realistically, there's some pretty big animals that live inside of that forest. And so some people in this group were a little bit nervous about walking through this forest. But ultimately, about half of the group said, you know what, whatever, let's just run through the forest and get back to our cars as fast as we can. I'm sure nothing will happen to us. And the other half decided they would look for an alternative route that would skirt the forest and allow the moonlight to be their guide along the way. That second group was made up of Sarah, along with two 18-year-old boys named Lance Bucci and Tyler Montague. So Sarah and these two boys, they're standing there and they're watching the first group go into the forest and disappear. And then she, along with these two guys, they turn right and they begin skirting the river and walking around the forest. And so they walk downstream with the river on one side and the forest on their left. And they're walking for a while until they see up ahead on their left, it looks like the forest is starting to thin out maybe a little bit. And so they took that as an opportunity to cut left and basically begin kind of going straight towards the parking lot, which was generally off to their left. And so they make that turn, they start walking, and the terrain is relatively open. It's this big open field with a couple of trees here and there. It was pretty easy to navigate, and they felt like, hey, we found a great alternative route. The moonlight's still shining through. We got great visibility. And so they're walking along happy as can be. And then they see there's a couple of streams up ahead. They get to the first stream and it's not that big, so they jump across it. They get to the next stream. It's still not that big. They jump across that one. And then they get to this third stream and they realize, it's still pretty small, but it's significantly bigger than the last two. And so if we mistime it, we could fall into it. Now, this was not some huge deal. They were already wet from having gone swimming, but they didn't want to jump in this stream. And so they considered walking off to the right and trying to find an area that was more narrow they could jump across more easily. But they figured they were probably within maybe 100 or 200 feet of the parking lot. They couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And they really didn't want to go farther and farther away to only have to just jump over this thing anyways. And so they decide, you know what? Let's just jump across it. Let's just do it. If we fall in, we fall in. And so the three of them backed up from the stream to give themselves some running room. And then they grabbed hands. And at the same time, all three of them ran forward and leapt across the stream. And they cleared it. They landed on the other side, but the ground they landed on was kind of loose and soft. And so it kind of crumbled underneath them and they all fell backwards into the stream. In the darkness, this stream had looked like the other two streams they had seen, albeit a little bit larger. And so they were not thinking this could be potentially hazardous if they fell into the water. But it would turn out this stream was extremely hazardous. It was nothing like the other two streams they had encountered. This one was runoff from a nearby hot spring. And so the temperature inside of this stream was 178 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was practically boiling water and it looked like it was shallow, but in fact, this stream was 10 feet deep. And so when this trio fell into these scalding waters, they let out blood-curdling screams, and the other group that had ran down the forest path, they had got to the parking lot and were waiting for them. And so they hear this scream and they just take off running in the direction of the screams. They cut right through the forest and they come out to that field and they find Lance and Tyler are on the edge of the stream, desperately trying to pull Sarah out of the water. And so the parking lot crew, they run over and they grab Sarah, they pull her out. They don't really know what's happened. They don't know this is some boiling stream, but it very quickly dawns on them when Lance and Tyler and Sarah just continue to scream outside of the water that something is horribly wrong. And so one of the people in the parking lot crew, they take off running, they go into one of their cars and they drive and they get help. And not that long after, a helicopter would arrive and it would take Sarah, Lance, and Tyler to a nearby hospital. It would turn out Lance and Tyler, when they fell into this water, they only submerged up to their necks. And as soon as they hit the water, they immediately turned and got themselves out again. So they were only in the water for maybe a second or two. And these things ultimately saved their lives. Although they did still have burns over almost their entire bodies. They had to go through dozens and dozens of surgeries and years of rehab, and they had to pay all this money for medical bills. So it was not a smooth course after they got pulled out, but they lived. As for Sarah, she was not as lucky. When she fell into the water, she completely submerged. Her head, her body, all of it went under the water, and then she just could not get herself out again. And so she stayed in the water much longer than the guys did. When she was admitted to the hospital, despite the fact she was talking and conscious, the doctors very quickly realized they had a big problem with her. A third-degree burn, or a full thickness burn, is when the outer layer of skin gets destroyed and also the inner, deeper tissues of the skin also gets destroyed, including the cells that are responsible for reproducing skin. And so if you get a third-degree burn, that part of your body will not heal on its own. You literally have to get a skin graft. And a skin graft is effectively a skin transplant. They will take other sections of skin from your body that are unburned and they will place them over that site where you have the third-degree burn. But when Sarah was wheeled into the operating room, it was determined that she had third-degree burns on 100% of her body. So there was no unburned skin to use for a skin graft. Her whole body was ruined. And so despite their best efforts, Sarah would pass away 15 hours after arriving at the hospital. A year later, Lance's family would sue the National Park Service for not having put up a sign near that particular stream to warn people of its dangers. But that lawsuit was tossed out because it was determined that the trio, Sarah, Tyler, and Lance, had chosen to walk off trail in a known thermal area, and so they were being negligent, not the park. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button has an itch on their back, offer to scratch it for them, but then continuously misunderstand their directions so you never actually itch the right spot. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.